Back in 2021, a group of scientists believed that they had solved the Dyatlov Pass Incident mystery using the movie Frozen, but I am here to tell them that it's time to let it go. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to Dyatlov Pass. When we first covered the Dyatlov Pass Incident 2 years ago, I said that it was probably one of the best known true horror stories out there, and I very much still believe that to be the case. But after writing the 2 follow-up videos, in which I covered the details of the injuries, proposed explanations, and the yet unanswered questions, I came to understand that it's not just one of the most famous, but also one of the most deeply misunderstood mysteries of the modern era. You see, of all the things people thought would solve the case, the Disney movie Frozen wasn't at the top of anyone's list. And yet, in 2021, that was the big story pertaining to Dyatlov Pass. According to National Geographic, a team of engineers used the impressive animation physics developed for the movie's snow effects to run an avalanche simulation, which they argued fully explained the injuries that occurred on the slopes of Zolotaryov. The Dyatlov Pass incident left 9 Russian hikers dead in 1959, an article from IndieWire read, adding that, now thanks to Frozen, the mystery has been solved. But had it? The answer, in my humble opinion, is a resounding no. As I waded through the mountain of documents from the journey, the medical reports, and the investigations, it became abundantly clear that while an avalanche was very possible, it simply could not explain a litany of factors associated with the case. It was certainly possible that an avalanche was the cause of the Dyatlov group's decision to leave their tent, that much can be said. The problem was that this explanation not only failed to account for where, how, and when everyone died, but also for a number of smaller details not directly connected to how each of the 9 hikers passed away. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends, about everything from who ended up in the party to how they ended up on the slope of that particular mountain in the first place. Questions like, why did they go down to the forest's edge only for half of them to turn around and try to climb back up? Or why were some of them fully clothed when they left the tent, while others seem to have hastily put on whatever clothes they could find? One also must wonder why all but one member of the expedition were under the age of 30, and why Semyon Zolotaryov had been added to the group at the last moment. And why did he have his camera out late at night on a barren mountainside? Why was his notebook apparently empty? How did he sustain injuries described by the medical examiner as consistent with a car crash, not only hours after the event which caused them to leave the tent, but also by falling less than 6 feet onto deep snow? Why were the bodies found in 3 separate places along the slope? What caused injuries consistent with a fistfight? And why did 2 members of the group appear to have climbed a tree? These questions, and many others, were at the front of my mind as I researched and wrote my way through 3 episodes on this most bizarre and infamous of tragedies, and to be quite honest, there are places where I'm still uncertain about what the truth might have been. That said, I am proud of the work that we did, and that's why I'm excited to bring you this very special episode on one of my favorite mysteries of all time. What you're about to see over the next 3 hours is not just a compilation of the original 3-episode series, but a reworking of the story which puts the pieces together in a way I never could have before finishing. Some things have been edited for clarity, explanations that appeared in later videos have been shifted into their proper places, and the narrative has been streamlined in order to present a version of events which addresses the questions that you may not have even known existed, and highlights the high strangeness of those which remain unanswered. Before we get to that, though, I need to talk to you about one of the sponsors who has helped make this show possible for a long time, and that is Fume. We've been working with these guys for over 2 years now, and it's because we genuinely like the product they're selling. The idea is simple. Bad habits are hard to break, so let's make the first step towards kicking it, taking the bad out of the bad habit. And Fume does that by providing a way to keep up with as many of the motions, feelings, and flavors as possible, all while getting rid of the harmful vapors, smoke, and chemicals. There's no electronics, no tars, no addictive chemicals, just a wooden cylinder, a steel frame, and a naturally flavored fiber core. Airflow is controlled by a little dial on the bottom, and the only thing you have to do to use it is breathe. I know my Fume helps me to avoid the temptation when I'm out and about, and I'm not the only person in my circle who has a success story with these guys. Over 500,000 people have already made the switch to Fume as part of their habit change journey, so if you're ready to try it for yourself, now's the time. And if you order the Journey Pack using code LORELODGE, you'll get a free fume topper, which is an awesome accessory to level up your experience. Click the link in our description, head to tryfume.com/lorelodge, or scan the QR code on your screen to get yours today. So as always, let's start with the region that we're talking about. Because one suggestion that was brought up was, well, hey, maybe they were attacked by some sort of uncontacted or primitive tribe in the area. Maybe it was a case of wrong place, wrong time, but it was human influence. Well, there is a native group there that was considered to be a possible culprit. Prior to the year 1959, Dyatlov Pass did not exist. It was just a slope of a mountain known as Peak 1079, or in the local Mansi language, it was called Hulatsakul. And it probably wasn't called exactly that, because there's absolutely no way I'm gonna get the pronunciation right on this without somebody giving it to me very directly, but it was something along those lines. It was only after 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov led an ill-fated hiking expedition across that slope that it received its now famous name. And in the language of the indigenous people of this area, the Mansi, that means dead mountain. Now, the Mansi are a Ugric language-speaking group of native Siberians who live in the Ural Mountain area. And at the time of Russian expansion into Siberia, the Mansi were a semi-nomadic people, so they made their living mostly off of herding, hunting, fishing, trapping, and they had some small-scale agriculture. They would settle in permanent villages for the winters and then spend the warmer months following the herds. And you might be thinking, hey, that sounds a lot like when the British and the French went to America, and it does in a lot of ways, except when the Russians went in, they found that the Mansi, prior to encountering the Empire of Russia, already had chainmail, iron weapons, and were using longbows, which I'm hesitant to believe this was an actual yew longbow, and I think it was probably a longer bow, and whoever was writing this didn't clarify, but I just want to make it clear, I don't think they were using Welsh-style longbows for any historians in the chat. In regards to culture, the Mansi had a sort of shamanistic animist religion. They had a bear cult, which was very popular amongst them, and is not unheard of amongst a lot of the Eastern European groups. Bear cults, bear worship, not something that's unusual. But this involves things like bear hunts and plays, singing, dancing, poetry, and feasting. The thing about the mountain being called Dead Mountain is that that's not quite a word-for-word translation of what the Mansi call it. They call it Silent Peak, and they call it Silent Peak because there's not really any game up there. They could never find a ton of animals, it just wasn't considered good hunting, so they didn't go up there. It started to become called Dead Mountain or Mountain of the Dead, mostly after the Dyatlov expedition. And speaking of the Dyatlov expedition, we should probably talk in detail about who these people were, because they weren't just 9 random hikers out for a walk on a Sunday. This wasn't your family saying, hey, let's get up and go hike that nearby small mountain trail. These guys were experienced hikers on their way out into the wilderness, not just to hike, but to also do some work. According to official documents, the route plan, the objectives, the goals were as follows. Number 1 was getting to know the natives and the economy of the Ural Mountains better. Number 2 was holding lectures and carrying out conversations with the public, which implies that when they got back from the expedition, they were supposed to maybe present papers or something. Number 3, which as far as I can tell is actually the primary reason the trip was even going on at all, was to improve the hiking experience of the members because they were all trying to get better certifications. They were all certified for grade 2 hikes, but not for grade 3, even though some members of the team had completed grade 3 hikes. By the end of it, everybody would be grade 3 certified. Number 4 was to study the depth of soil freezing according to surveys and the observations of the public. Now, as for the hiking certification issue, that appears to have been, as I said, the primary purpose of this expedition. The other 3 seem to have been sort of ways of justifying it. Now, we've got to remember that these are Soviet hiking grades, not modern Russian hiking grades, so a grade 3 would not match what would currently be a grade 3. A grade 3 hike back then in Russia would have been 300 kilometers in distance. A third of that had to be on terrain that was difficult. We're talking about rocks, ice, no roads. It also had to be 16 days in length, and at least 8 of those days had to be spent out away from populated areas. The participants were all experienced hikers, and all but one of them were current or former Ural Polytechnic Institute students, but from varying degree fields. Almost all of them were engineers. Igor Dyatlov was the expedition's leader, and he was a gifted engineer who at the age of just 20 pioneered a short-distance radio as well as a hiking stove, both for use in backpacking. As you can imagine, he was known as an intelligent guy and a very experienced hiker, as well as a man who simply had good character. Along with him were 9 companions between the ages of 20 and 38, all of whom were experienced hikers, and all of whom were looking to get certifications so that they could go on and lead higher difficulty treks. They were also almost all students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. It was initially a 10-person expedition. Of course, Yuri Yudin, the 10th member, was the one who turned back. Also, for the rest of the video, I'm going to warn you, these are all Russian names. I'm going to try my best, but my mouth doesn't make these sounds naturally. Lyudmila Dubinina was a 20-year-old engineering and economics student, and she was the group's treasurer. She was also known as being a wise and compassionate young woman and a good leader. This was her 7th long-distance trek and her first true grade 3 hike using the old Soviet grade system. And this would not be the first time that she got injured on a hiking expedition, because on a previous expedition, she'd actually been shot in the leg. It was an accident. There was no, weirdness here. One of the people on the trip was a hunter and had a rifle, and negligent discharge. Things happen. Her friends described her as being wise, thoughtful, fair, and a good leader. She was known for being very attentive to the needs of her companions, and she was extremely excited about going on this trip. 24-year-old Alexander Klevatov, the group's equipment manager, was also a nuclear engineering student preparing for a career with the Soviet Nuclear Arms Division. The Dyatlov expedition would be his 10th hike and his 2nd grade 3. Zina Kolmogorova was another radio engineering student like Dyatlov, and she was in charge of the group's diary. She was known for being a very kind and respectful introvert, and may have also had a romantic relationship of some kind with Igor Dyatlov. One of the more experienced members of the group, this would be her 15th long-distance trek, and her 3rd at the grade 3 level. She was also chair of the qualifying commission for the hiking club at UPI. 23-year-old Rustem Slobodin was in charge of the group's repair toolkit, and he was also a long-distance runner and a mandolin player. He wasn't very talkative, but he was known for being very courageous in the face of outdoor dangers. Nikolai Thibault Bernol was the 23-year-old son of a French communist in exile, and himself had achieved a PhD in construction engineering, which I believe would be equivalent to a civil engineering PhD in the United States. Thibault was also a member of the qualifying commission. This would be his 5th trek, his 2nd grade 3, and he had led hikes in the past, but he had no special assignment on this one. He was just along for the ride. The 23-year-old Yuri Krivonishenko was the group's topographer, and he was also a close friend of Igor Dyatlov, who went along with him on essentially every expedition he could. Yuri Krivonishenko was also something of an interesting character for another reason, which comes into play much later. We talked about it in part 2. He is one of the guys who had radiation on his clothing. And I'll get more into this later in the video, but I wanted to give you some information about his actual job first. He had been a hydraulics student, and after graduation had gone on to work at the Chelyabinsk 40 nuclear facility, which is famous for the 1957 Kishtim disaster. Yuri was actually there when a plutonium leak released more radioactive material than Chernobyl, but because it blew away from the population centers, it actually affected fewer people. Unfortunately, at the time of that disaster, the effects of radiation were not quite as well understood as they would be later, so there weren't as many safety protocols in order, which meant that people who were there the day of that leak went home without decontaminating their clothing. In fact, when that disaster went down, they didn't even evacuate the town for a whole week when they finally started to realize that something was seriously wrong. But Yuri seems to have survived just fine, and this was his 9th expedition, and I believe it was his 1st grade 3. Aside from being the group's topographer, the 23-year-old was also kind of known for being the camp comic relief. The oldest member of the group was 38-year-old Semyon Zolotaryov, who was actually not listed in the project plan and was added to the expedition at the last minute to replace a guy by the name of Vladislav Bienko. He was a sports instructor and World War II veteran seeking his Master of Sports title, and this would be his 2nd grade 3 hike. He had planned to take another hiking trip for similar purposes as the rest of them for his profession, and at the last minute, due to connections within the Communist Party, he managed to get himself reassigned to Dyatlov's trip, which was a little bit shorter. Zolotaryov is also an interesting character in the story because while he was initially not part of the plan, and everyone was a little skeptical of the old guy who was involved, he did very quickly ingratiate himself, though although diaries suggest he kept his distance, but involved himself to the extent that it wasn't weird. He was just trying to give people respect and space. But he was also a veteran. He had kind of bounced around the military a little bit, and his record suggests that he was never really the greatest at being in the military, but nonetheless, he was able to pull some favors in the Communist Party to get himself onto this hike so he wouldn't have to go on a longer one. And then, if you look at the official project plan, there's a few names that are on that don't end up being on the trip. Those are specifically Vishnevsky, Popov, Blenko, Verhitov, and Yudin. Now, Yuri Yudin was the only member of the group to both go on the trip and survive. Interestingly enough, Blenko, who didn't end up going, was supposed to be the group's historian. Yuri Yudin, I forgot what age he was, but Yuri Yudin was the only member of the group to survive, and only because a flare-up in his sciatic nerve forced him to return home a few days into the trip. He was along primarily for geological reasons, because that was his field of study, and they were passing through an old geology camp, but at the same time, he was also an avid hiker. This was his 7th expedition, and let me check really quick, it was his 2nd grade 3. So that should, in summary, cover everybody who was on the trip.
Did he forget about Doroshenko?
You know, if I had a nickel for every time I had forgotten about Yuri Doroshenko in one of our Dyatlov Pass videos, I'd have 2 nickels, which is not a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. We should probably do that.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Okay, I'll come in.
Yeah.
All right, so Yuri Doroshenko was a 4th-year radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, friends with Igor Dyatlov, and an ex-boyfriend of Zina Kolmogorova. Now, if you'll just give me a minute. Basically, the guy was good friends with the two of them. He did not let it affect him when they broke up, and there was an interesting anecdote about a former camping trip on which he actually chased away a bear with a camping sledgehammer. Now, I find that one particularly interesting because, you know, it suggests to me that this is a guy who was generally fearless and liked to support and protect those he cared about. But a lot of people might look at it and say, well, you know, maybe the stuff with him and Dyatlov and Kolmogorova, because Dyatlov and Kolmogorova seemed like maybe they had something going on, you might think that's going to cause problems. But at the end of the day, it seems very unlikely, because even if he was the reason they left the tent, it seems odd that he would condemn all 9 of them to certain death over a girl that he otherwise seemed to have no issues with.
I know I have to do this editing late because I have to get the ads in, but do you ever sleep?
No. What's that guy talking about? So, the 10 members of the group as it started received their route book on the 23rd of January, 1959, and on that, their trail was marked as route number 5. And I will admit, a lot of this planning stuff is a little bit of unfamiliar territory to me, because it's not clear to me who all of the authorities actually were. They had to file a lot of paperwork. There were certain things they were supposed to file that didn't get filed. They were still allowed to go on the trip. There's some weird stuff about, you know, how many responsibilities everybody has. So maybe it's just that the Soviet Union had a different system that I did not totally understand, or maybe this is just kind of overcomplicated because communists. Their trek would begin from Yekaterinburg on the 23rd of January, 1959, and from there they traveled by truck and by train to the town of Vizhai. They left Yekaterinburg on the 23rd of January and arrived in Sarov the next morning. They left Sarov for Ivdel at 6:30 p.m. and then arrived in Ivdel around midnight and then departed again for Vizhai about 5 in the morning. An entry in the group diary kept by Kolmogorova, which of course had multiple authors. It seems that everybody had a different day that they were supposed to record. But that diary says that they left the window in their hotel room open just a little bit and that it got a bit cold. It also notes the temperature outside at negative 17 degrees Celsius. If you use freedom units, that's 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The coldest weather I can ever remember going out in was negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It was when I was at Penn State, and it was so cold that every single student signed a change.org petition to cancel classes because it was negative 10 degrees with a negative 25-degree wind chill, and they still tried to have class. Remarking on the lukewarm tea that they are said to have been served at the hotel, Dyatlov apparently said, "Go drink it outside, it'll feel hot." The group then negotiated a truck ride to District 41, which so far as I can tell was a logging area. And an entry from the same day by Tebow reads, "I can't, although I tried," which is how I figured that, you know what, it seems like every member was supposed to try and put something in the diary, not just that they could. Also, the planned route had them skiing from Vizhay to District 41 on the first and second days. I'm not sure if they were allowed to take a truck, but I assume that if it was in the diary, they were allowed to take a truck. While at District 41, they talked about how they had a great time talking with the loggers and hanging out, swapping stories, singing songs, and of course, doing all the normal stuff you might do out in the Siberian wilderness. On the morning of the 27th, they departed District 41 to head to the abandoned geological outpost of 2nd Northern. This was quite literally just an abandoned village of log cabins that they stayed in overnight. There were like 2 buildings that were usable. And Doroshenko remarked in the group diary that the weather was great. The group made a deal to borrow a horse on the way to 2nd Northern, and the diary also notes that they heard some illegal counter-revolutionary songs. They left for 2nd Northern at 4 p.m. on the 27th, and the diary notes that the horse made it slow going because the horse was just kind of slow, but it also says, "What a pleasure to go without backpacks." So it means that they were basically sacrificing speed for comfort. Unfortunately, that meant that in 2 hours, by 6 p.m., they had only gone 8 kilometers. That's just 5 miles, and the total hike from District 41 to 2nd Northern was a full 24 kilometers or 15 miles. They eventually made it to 2nd Northern very late in the evening after dark, and also there was the problem of Yuri realized that he was not going to be able to keep going, and Yuri Yudin, because there's like 4 Yuris on this trip. The diary notes that they stayed up the majority of the night until about 3 a.m., and that everybody was in good spirits, but they were disappointed that they would be losing Yuri. The site they were staying at, 2nd Northern Village, was an abandoned work camp, and it was also a rather significant geological site at some point, enough that Yuri Yudin decided that he was going to take a few people, and since he was a geologist, go and see if they could find any interesting gemstones or anything that would be worth bringing back to the university. As for lodging, there were 20 to 25 houses there, but only one of them was actually livable, and several people managed to hurt themselves on nails and boards and such. It is rather impressive that they managed to find this entire thing in what was essentially pure darkness with only the stars and moon to guide themselves. The morning of the 28th began with everybody else waking up to the rumbling of the voices of Krivonashenko and Kolevatov, which I can't tell what exactly that's supposed to mean. There's some suggestions in the diary that maybe Kolevatov and Krivonashenko were not getting along super well, but it's also hard to say, and I don't want to make any assumptions because there really is nothing concrete in the diaries. This was the point at which Yuri Yudin decided to take a few people and go look for gemstones, but all they were able to find was quartz and pyrite, so there was really nothing worth taking. They left the camp at 11:45 a.m., Yuri Yudin headed back for District 41, and the rest of the group headed on to Mount Otorten, at which point it was just a wilderness trek following trails left by the native population, and they did that until they reached the Ospia River on the 29th. They were headed up the Lozva River, and the way that this was working was the group would head up the river, and Krivonashenko would kind of trail behind to make topographical notes. They stopped at about 5:30 p.m. to set up camp along the side of the river, and they also took some time to sew curtains for the tent out of sheets, which, to my understanding, was a way of kind of keeping a bit more air sealed in so that it was warmer. They also had some dinner, Slobodin played the mandolin, and they talked about love. According to the diary, the portable stove that they had brought along hung in a way that it kind of divided the tent into 2 sections. And while this entry is unsigned, its author writes that whoever the author is, as well as Kolmogorova, sleep on the further section of the tent. Apparently nobody wanted to sleep by the stove where it was too hot, or maybe they were worried about burning themselves or something like that, and they elected that Krivonashenko was going to sleep there, but he was not super happy about that, and he at some point got up, started cursing at everybody, and the diary even says, or at least the translation says, that he accused some people of treason. The only other person who is named in this diary entry is Kolevatov, who apparently was sleeping by the entrance to the tent. I do think that there are some translation issues between Russian and English here, because just some stuff doesn't make sense here. It's a 12-person tent, there's 9 people in it, why are only 4 of them named? Why only these ones? What was the relevance here? What was going on? From there, they followed it west into the mountains until they reached the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. As for the 29th of January, not much is written, and that's probably because it was Thibault's day, and he was the guy who wrote earlier, "I can't, although I tried." There is, however, a PS written there that says, "Witless writing in 2 days." The person writing in 2 days would be Dyatlov, so that was either a joke or Thibault was frustrated with Dyatlov. All we get for that day is that they took a Mansi deer trail to find the Aspia River, and that it was negative 13 degrees Celsius. The entry for the 30th is unsigned and split into 2, one of them appearing to have been written on the go, and the other one appears to have been when they got back to camp. It's noted that the curtains are quote-unquote quite justified, so that is why I assume that they had something to do with heat. It's also noted that the stove was working well, but both Thibault and Krivonashenko thought that there were ways they could probably improve it, possibly with steam heat, something like that, so that their nights were a little bit warmer. They had gotten up at 8:30 a.m. that morning, eaten breakfast, took down camp, and started hiking up the Mansi trails. The writer mentions that the Mansi are an interesting northern people who have both their own written language as well as a standardized series of glyphs to tell you different things as you were out in the forest. If you've ever played the Thieves Guild questline of Skyrim, you're probably familiar with this concept. It also refers to the numbers of the Mansi and says that it's a small nation of about 8,000 people. The second entry basically only talks about the weather. It is cold. The snow is said to be about 4 feet deep outside of the trail, and it notes that they were having some trouble because they would follow well-beaten trails that turned into trodden paths that just abruptly ended because these were hunting trails for the most part where somebody had been following deer. The writer says that you can feel the altitude, but also that everything is as usual and there's no reason to be concerned, basically. On the 31st, they constructed a labaz, or a cache, on the southern side of the mountain, and then they stayed overnight, heading up the mountain on February 1st. And then we have Dyatlov writing the entry for January 31st, 1959, the night before the incident. They started up a Mansi trail at 10 a.m. and eventually actually came across a Mansi hunter. The weather was very bad, they could not see very far ahead of them, and he mentioned how they basically would have one person go a little bit ahead, 5 minutes, then come back, that person would rest, the rest of the group would push forward, the person at the head then would go ahead 5 minutes, come back, rest, push forward, so that they could all form a trail, and it wasn't all of them constantly trying to trailblaze at the same time. It was very slow going, and they only progressed at a rate of about 1 mile an hour in negative 11 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very, very below freezing. For those of you using the metric system, that's about negative 23 degrees Celsius. They made their way out of the Aspia Valley up towards the mountain pass they needed to take to get back into the Lozva Valley, with Dyatlov writing as they went. He mentions that the trees were thinning, the firs being replaced by birch forest. And I had to look for a bit better of a translation on this specific point, but Dyatlov does remark on how hostile the terrain is. It got very icy after they left the tree line, and he mentions that the making of a storage depot, which was something that they actually had to do on the trip, was not going to be possible up there. They began looking for a place to set up camp around 4 p.m., and they realized setting up camp up on top of the mountain was not going to work. They could not do this far above the tree line, so they headed back down a ways into the valley a little bit more and set up camp down there. It's also said the only wood they could get was wet, weak fir, but that it was warm enough inside of the tent. The very last line of the final entry in the group diary is Dyatlov saying, "It is difficult to imagine such comfort somewhere in a mountain range, wind howling outside, hundreds of kilometers from any inhabited places." At this point in the journey, it seems that they were actually already behind by almost a day, and if they did not get moving soon, they would be closing in on 2. By the 31st, they should have already entered the Lozva Valley. They should not be camping in the Aspia Valley. By the end of the day on the 1st of February, they absolutely should not have been in the Aspia Valley, but they found themselves being forced to camp in the open in a pass on the 1st. Part of the reason they had to camp out in the open is that they still needed to create that storage depot in the Aspia, and they had to spend an inordinate amount of time on the 1st searching for it. So when they should have been traveling several miles that day, they really only traveled a couple kilometers. Around 3 p.m. on the 1st, they finally were able to establish their camp, and that was how late in the day they ended up trying to hike out of the Aspia Valley. By 6 p.m., they'd only made it about a kilometer up the mountain, and it was getting dark, they needed to set up camp, and they were forced to set up camp on the slope at 900 meters in elevation. What happened after that is very hotly debated, but here's what we know. The group should have returned to Vizay by February 12th at the latest, at which point he was to telegram UPI to inform them that the group had made it back. However, he had told Yuri Yudin that he expected the trip was going to take a little bit longer than had been planned, so nobody was super worried for the first couple days that nobody said anything. But by the 20th, over a week since they were supposed to be back, people started clamoring for answers, specifically family members of the hikers. The first to become uneasy was Alex Kolotov's sister, Rima Kolevatova. And there was enough uproar that a group of students and teachers actually volunteered to go looking, others from UPI, and they set off on the 21st. Then on the 26th, it's confirmed that Nikita Khrushchev actually received a telegram about this. It was shown to him on the 27th, and then on the 28th, there was actually an official decision to send out a rescue party. In what is essentially a joke about the inefficiency of government, by the 28th, when the government did decide to send out a search party, the student volunteers had already found the tent 2 days earlier. It was on Peak 1079 in an area where the slope of the mountain was 18 to 20 degrees. The tent entrance itself was facing the pass. Part of the issue, though, here is that the exact location of the tent is in dispute. So in considering environmental factors, especially something as localized as an avalanche, you have to make sure that you're looking at the right spot on the mountain. Officials place it at 61 degrees, 75 minutes, and 95 seconds north, 59 degrees, 42 minutes, 96 seconds east, whereas independent researchers place the tent at 61 degrees, 45 minutes, 30 seconds north, and 59 degrees, 25 minutes, 46 seconds east, which is about 116 meters southwest. The snow beneath the tent had been flattened, the skis were stacked outside, it was almost completely covered in snow, and it was torn in 2 places. The side facing the hill had a small tear in it that seemed to be plugged by a fur jacket, and the side facing the slope was torn open from the inside as if with a knife. Documentation suggests that the sleeping order that night, and possibly most nights, was as follows. It would have begun Dyatlov at the back, then Slobodin and Kolevatov, in that order, and then, in an unknown order, Doroshenko, Kolmogorova, and Krivonishenko, and then, in the following order again, Tibo, Dubinina, and Zolotaryov. Additionally, the tent contained a number of items. At the entrance were the stove, an axe, a saw, a couple of buckets, and in one of those buckets, a jar of medical alcohol. Further back were the cameras, and at the very end, by Dyatlov, were an unsigned diary, maps, documents, Dyatlov's camera, a tin box of money, a bag of crackers, and a bag of barley. I do not know why they had barley. I really can't think of why they would have had barley. Against the wall, we're just told that other products were present, as well as 2 pairs of shoes, and the other 6 pairs were on the opposite side, with 3.5 pairs of felt boots somewhere scattered in the middle. As far as the shoes issue goes, everybody on the trip had multiple pairs of shoes. Their backpacks were spread across the bottom of the tent, with quilted jackets on top of those, and quilted blankets on top of the quilted jackets, with additional blankets set aside. Most of the warm clothes they had were also sitting atop the blankets. The next day, the 27th, bodies began to appear. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko were the first to be found, and they were under a cedar tree about 1.5 kilometers from the tent. They had gone northeast, and they had managed to set up a fire under the cedar tree. The fire was actually the first thing spotted by the volunteers, because it was a clearly man-made object, even though it was out. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko were found a couple of meters away from it, one on his stomach, the other on his back, right next to each other. And this was spotted by Yuri Kopletov and Mikhail Sherevin. Additionally, beneath the bodies were a number of broken branches. Doroshenko lay on his stomach. He was wearing a checkered short-sleeve shirt, a sleeveless cotton undershirt, shorts, swim trunks, badly ripped cotton underwear, and a different set of socks on each foot with no shoes. The socks on his left foot had been burned, and it appeared that his body had been moved after death. His hand also sported a minor burn. Krivonishenko was found on his back, and he wore a long-sleeved checkered shirt, cotton undershirt, swim trunks, long underpants, and a single sock on his left foot. Dyatlov and Kolmogorova were the next to be found, Kolmogorova about 850 meters away from the cedar tree. She was buried under 10 to 50 centimeters of snow, I've seen both numbers, laying on her right side in a position that indicated that she was struggling to maintain her movement. She was wearing wearing 2 hats, a long-sleeved undershirt, sweater, checkered shirt, and a second sweater with a torn cuff on the right sleeve. She also wore cotton sport pants, trousers, ski pants, and 3 pairs of socks, 2 of which were thin, the third wool with insoles, and she was not wearing real boots. Dyatlov was found between the cedar tree and Kolmogorova by a Mansi tracking group. He was laying on the ground on his back, his head towards the tent, with his arms across his chest as if he was like doing a Superman ripping off the shirt kind of motion. And I'm not saying that to make a joke. If you look at the picture, that's literally what it looks like. Obviously, we cannot show you post-mortem photos on here. One of the odd things about Dyatlov, if you look at the photo, and I'll have a link to all of this information in the description, but if you look at the photo, it looks as if he died in the middle of this motion. It was as if he just flash froze. As for what he himself was wearing, he wore an unbuttoned sleeveless fur vest, sweater, long sleeve cotton shirt, sleeveless cotton singlet, pants, ski pants, and 2 socks, 1 cotton and 1 wool, and his watch was stopped at 5:31. That was all they found on the 27th, but not much longer, on March 5th, they did find the body of Rustim Slobodin. He was 480 meters from the same cedar tree between the locations of Kolmogorova and Dyatlov. He was face down, his arms flung out to the sides, and he was wearing a long sleeve undershirt, shirt, sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt boot on his right foot. His watch stopped at 8:45 a.m. I say a.m. because it's almost positive these guys died in the morning. But surprisingly, the other 4 members of the group were nowhere to be found, but they also hadn't turned up anywhere saying, hey, hi, I'm alive. And this might be because the search team had underestimated how deep the snow actually was, because it took until May 5th, when the snow was finally melting, for another Mansi tracker or hunter to actually come across their belongings. The first thing to be spotted was a pair of black sweatpants where part of the right leg had been cut off. They also then found a woman's sweater, and not long after that, several corpses. And that Mansi man's name was Kuryakov, from what I can tell. After some searching, Dubinina was found on her knees with her face and chest pressed against the rock. She wore a short sleeve shirt, a long sleeve shirt, 2 sweaters, underwear, long socks, 2 pairs of pants, 2 more pairs of short socks, and a hat. Zolotaryov and Kolevatov were found breast to back, with Kolevatov's chest to Zolotaryov's back. Zolotaryov wore 2 hats, a scarf, short sleeve shirt, long sleeve shirt, black sweater, and a coat, and then on the bottom, he had underwear, 2 pairs of pants, a pair of ski pants, socks, and slippers. Kolevatov, behind him, was wearing a sleeveless shirt, long sleeve shirt, sweater, fleece sweater, ski jacket, unzipped, as well as shorts, ski pants, and canvas pants with wool socks underneath them, and there were actually a couple of pairs of other socks under the wool socks. Kolevatov's socks had signs of fire damage, and very interestingly, there were several 7 to 8 centimeter long gashes in the jacket's right arm. Finally, Thibault wore a canvas fur hat over a homemade wool hat, a shirt, wool sweater, fur jacket, underwear, sweatpants, cotton pants, ski pants, wool socks, and felt boots. He also had gloves, but was not wearing them. They were in his pocket, as well as 2 watches stopped at 8:14 and 8:30. With all of the members of the group accounted for, it was time for everybody to try and figure out what actually happened here, which involved 2 full investigations, one immediately in the aftermath and one much later on. There were simply so many unanswered questions. Had they gone up there and everybody was in the same place and they had all frozen to death, that's one thing. Or if the tent had burned down, that's another thing. If somebody had gunshot wounds, then at least you know that somebody else killed these people. But instead, they had 9 bodies in various states of physical distress and injury. All of these people were dead, and nobody really knew why. And I think the very first question to address here is the cause of death one. The first 4 bodies to be found were autopsied by a team, and that team was led by Boris Vozrozdenie. All 4 of those first bodies to be autopsied were determined to have died of hypothermia, despite the presence of other definitely not hypothermia consistent injuries. The medical examiners, as a group, weren't really super confident in the hypothermia answer as being the sole cause of death, but they did have to provide a concrete, firm cause of death that could be backed up with evidence, so they said hypothermia. But interestingly, when Slobodin was found just a week later, the only person to autopsy him was Vozrozdenie. Slobodin also had several injuries that were not consistent with hypothermia that must have occurred after they left the tent that night, and yet he was also hypothermia. There are some possibilities possibilities here before we get too conspiratorial. It could be that the first 4 bodies were autopsied by a team because it was simply too much work for one man to perform quickly. Or it could be that by the time Slobodin rolled in, Vozrozhdenie had gone to his superiors and said, hey, I don't think this was hypothermia, maybe we should keep this on the down low. However, if there were any doubts that something other than hypothermia was killing people here, they were completely confirmed with the bodies of the next 4. All 4 had been found in a den that they constructed, they were all well dressed, and all 4 had significant physical injuries. This time, when the autopsies rolled around, 3 out of 4 did not list hypothermia as the cause of death. Looking at those 4, Dubinina was found pressed against a wall with her eyes and tongue missing, nose and ribs broken, and her cause of death was listed as massive internal bleeding due to multiple rib fractures. Thibault was half submerged in meltwater as it streamed down the ravine, with a massive fracture to the temporal bone on the right side of his head and hemorrhaging in the right forearm. The cause of death was listed as bleeding in the brain. Zolotaryov, remember, was found in the arms of Kolevatov. His eyes were missing, he had massively broken ribs, and his cause of death was listed as massive internal bleeding as a result of his chest essentially being crushed. Kolevatov, on the other hand, had no major physical injuries. His neck was deformed, is all the autopsy says, and he had a wound behind his right ear, but the autopsy suggests that the wound behind the right ear was post-mortem, and the neck deformation also may have been post-mortem. So Kolevatov was ruled to have died of hypothermia, but why did he die of hypothermia with his arms wrapped around a man who was dying of his chest being crushed? Like I said, questions. And for decades, people have had a lot of questions about Dyatlov Pass. What caused them to leave their tent, and why was it slashed open from the inside? Why did members of the group try to climb that cedar tree, as evidenced by the fact that there are branches broken as high as 5 meters up, and several people had tears in the skin of their hands? When did the group separate, and why did they leave the cedar? Why did Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin alone try to reach the tent, or did the other rest of the group try to reach the tent with them and turn back? Were Kolmogorova, Slobodin, and Dyatlov all coming back to the tent from the cedar, or were they on their way to the cedar? And why did they choose to go back to the tent from the cedar if they did? Of those who were not found between the tent and the cedar, why did they choose to build a den? And perhaps the most interesting question of all, why did a bunch of them die of hypothermia, and then the ones in the den appear to have died of significant physical trauma? For a long time, the only answer anybody had was the official answer. The cause of their death was overwhelming physical force, which the hikers were unable to overcome. That sheer lack of any legitimate answers backed up by any real evidence led to a flurry of theories regarding everything from natives attacking to military tests to Yetis. Aliens, bioweapons, cover-up, you name it, it has been responsible for Dyatlov Pass. In fact, I would bet you that John Mulaney has a story about being blamed for Dyatlov Pass.
I was over on the bench.
And then finally, in 2020, after a reinvestigation effort that lasted several years, we finally got an official answer that wasn't just, overwhelming force? And not to make 2 Skyrim references in one video, but this is different from unrelenting force. We're not sitting here saying that somebody was up on that mountain going Fusro Da at these people. But the man in charge of that investigation, Andrei Kuryakov, who is the deputy head of the Prosecutor General's office for the Urals Federal District, made an announcement. It was an avalanche. And that answer satisfied some people, as it explained 2 things: why they left the tent, and why the tent was destroyed and covered in snow. The theory was also bolstered by the fact that engineers, hearing of this, used the snow physics modeling from Disney's Frozen to recreate the conditions that led to this avalanche. But there are some things that it actually doesn't explain. For example, the injuries to Dubinina, Thibault, and Zolotaryov. If they had sustained the injuries they sustained up at the tent, they would not have made it to their den. And therein lies the problem of the mystery of Dyatlov Pass. Every time some question is answered, it seems to create a different one. There is no single explanation that accounts for every factor of this case. So that's precisely what we're going to do. The avalanche theory is pretty central to the whole Dyatlov Pass issue since 2020. Before 2020, there was still a general official mystery here. Nobody had come up with a solid explanation, or at the very least, nobody had made an official declaration that, yes, this is in fact what happened here. Basically, for 6 decades, from 1959 until 2020, the official explanation was, and I quote, "overwhelming force which the hikers were not able to overcome." All of that would change when in 2018, the Russian government opened up a new investigation into the Dyatlov Pass incident. The stated goal of the investigation was to leave only one of the 75 theories regarding what happened that night standing, but at the same time, they were only actually looking at natural phenomena there, so they weren't considering things like military tests, UFOs, Bigfoot, all of the other things that have kind of been suggested by the more paranormally inclined, more superstitious side of the internet. While it's definitely understandable that an official investigation by a government, at least the public-facing side, would not involve aliens or Bigfoot, what's interesting is that they did entirely leave out, they did not consider criminal outcomes, criminal explanations. So somebody coming along this group and causing harm to them, a group of prisoners was considered back in 1959, but that was debunked during the 1959 investigation. So yes, it makes sense that an official government investigation would ignore some of the more paranormal stuff, but the fact that they completely discounted any human activity, any human cause, is interesting to me. And another interesting thing about this is that they sought to figure out if the bodies, not just of Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, who as we know were moved after death for sure, they wanted to figure out if the rest of the bodies were staged. And to me that's intriguing, because why would your official investigation only look at natural phenomena and explicitly discount humans, while also trying to figure out if humans manipulated the bodies after death? And finally, they wanted to explain the non-hypothermia-related injuries sustained by most members of the group. As for why they reopened this investigation so many years later, it was 2018, their official reasoning was a little weird. The official reason that the investigation was reopened is that the expedition was under the direction of a state institution and approved by government employees. As such, they of course needed to get answers to how the government could allow something like this to happen. But of course, at this point, we're talking about 59 years between the actual incident itself and the reopened investigation, and we're not talking about something that happened back in the 90s after the Soviet Union fell. It's not like the Russian Federation appeared as a political entity and said, hey, we should maybe go reinvestigate some of those cold cases that the Soviets weren't able to come up with an answer for. But that's not what happened. They waited until 2018, long after the fall of the Soviet Union. All of the temporal weirdness notwithstanding, the lead prosecutor on the case, Andrei Kuryakov, said the following: "Until we reach a conclusion, such circumstances could be repeated. If we say what happened, it will be possible to correct the rules of behavior on such trips." So it seems that the official reason for the investigation, in simple English, was, we just want to make sure this doesn't happen again. But again, why wait 60 years for that? Now, of course, there's kind of an answer to this, which is the media. The media, one Russian company in particular, managed to get their hands on Zolotaryov's body. They managed to petition for him to be exhumed so they could re-examine his skeleton. That happened on April 12th, 2018, and there were some interesting results. There had long been a theory that the body they found that was identified as Semyon Zolotaryov was in fact not Semyon Zolotaryov, and that he had never been on the trip, and somebody else entirely was living under his name. In fact, some have suggested that he even disappeared during World War II and never came back. Somebody else had just adopted this persona. And this was partially due to tattoos on his body that his family did not recognize, but Zolotaryov didn't live in the same place as his family. He had not seen them in some time before dying. It's possible also that they just did not see these tattoos on his body before. He might have gotten them during the war or after the war. But in order to dispel this rumor, they decided they would just test his remains for DNA. The problem was, when they did have the DNA tested, it did not match any of Semyon Zolotaryov's living relatives. Those were his niece and nephew, and so of course they're using mitochondrial DNA here. And Alexei Gorokovenko, the geneticist who ran these tests, said that he was certain there was no possible way that Semyon Zolotaryov was the man that they found on that expedition. Whatever corpse they had exhumed, it wasn't his. But of course everybody wanted a second opinion still, and that's when a man named Pavel Ivanov got involved, and while I couldn't find a ton on him in English, from what I understand, this man is a pretty big deal in the Russian genetics field. He determined that that first test was completely wrong, and there was in fact a 99.66% chance that that man was Semyon Zolotaryov, or Semyon Zolotaryov's brother. They could not get any more exact than that due to the nature of the DNA test. The Nikolay angle is interesting because, and I'm going to be honest, I did not do a ton of research into this side, so I can't say for certain if it's true, but it's rumored that Nikolay Zolotaryov decided that he wasn't really vibing with communism and defected to the Germans during the war and disappeared afterwards. Personally, while I understand not vibing with communism, I feel like there were better options than joining the Nazis. So the revelation that the DNA did in fact match, and this was Semyon Zolotaryov, and no one really needed to worry about that angle, that was enough to get people to stop asking questions about that specific conspiracy, but the Dyatlov Pass can of worms had been opened once again, and the Russian media was craving answers. But in August of 2018, a court refused to reopen the case, stating that only the Prosecutor General's office had the right to do so. A month later, in September of 2018, they did just that. And then, in March of 2019, after some months of deliberation and planning, an expedition including government officials, scientists, experts, and various independent researchers all made their way out to the Ural Mountains to head to Dyatlov Pass and determine, are any of us right? And they were looking into a number of possibilities. These included some kind of out there things like UFOs, human enhancement experiments, missile tests, and infrasound. Of course, the government was primarily focused on a few specific theories, including avalanches and katabatic winds. And as far as the expedition, the timing, the people involved, how much can you trust it, it is important to note a couple of things. A, they brought along a lot of people, including some people with pretty wacky ideas. But also, Kuryakov was working on his PhD at the time, and his dissertation just so happened to be about Dyatlov Pass. And then, eventually, on July 11th, 2020, Kuryakov announced to the world that they had their answer. They knew what happened at Dyatlov Pass. It was an avalanche. And of course, if you were to ask, okay, well, walk us through this, how did this work? The answers go a little something like this. To the question of why did they leave the tent, the answer was pretty straightforward. An avalanche. There was a mix of actual material evidence as well as some situational evidence that they were like, all right, well, if you look at this, it hints at this, and if we can tie all of these together, basically exactly what we do at this channel. That included a couple of observations, such as the fact that Thibault and Zolotaryov were by far the best dressed of the group. The way that this is all rationalized by the Russian government is that Thibault was probably the one on duty that night, the one who was supposed to be up looking to make sure that they weren't attacked by wild animals, and that there wasn't an avalanche, and that, a Yeti didn't come out of the woods. As for Zolotaryov, his state of being well-dressed is kind of, the explanation for it is kind of dependent on the avalanche theory being correct, which was that Zolotaryov was dressed because he felt like an avalanche was possible in this area. It suggested that Zolotaryov would have had this predictive capability due to his time in the military, and that's why he looked around and went, maybe not. Now, of course, if you look at Zolotaryov's military bio, it doesn't look great. He bounces around a lot. It seems like he never really found his footing. He did fight, it seems, but he's not Spetsnaz here. The main reason that Zolotaryov would have had a solid idea that maybe this was not the best place for them to camp would have been the fact that he was in fact a sporting instructor. This was his job. Leading trips like this was what Zolotaryov did for a living. Zolotaryov would have, sensing the avalanche coming, informed everybody. They would have cut their way out of the tent to get out of it faster. According to Kuryakov, all of this is textbook avalanche survival stuff. The very next thing that the group did after leaving the tent was walk about 1.5 kilometers downhill to the tree line. All of the evidence suggests that they did this in a pretty orderly manner. It was not panicked. They were walking single file, straight line. They knew where they were going. Somebody was in command. This was not a panicked rush anywhere. And after their little trek, they ended up at a cedar tree. It was pointed out to me that cedar does not natively grow in this area, and it was probably a fir tree. I'm not sure why it's referred to as cedar. Maybe there was, for some reason, one lone cedar out there. But the point is, this tree gets referred to throughout the documentation as the cedar. But the next question that the media asked of Kuryakov at the press conference was, well, what happened at the cedar? It appears that the first thing they attempted to do was build a fire, and they succeeded at doing this for about 90 minutes as far as the burned logs suggest. But 90 minutes in, either the fire died or it became clear that it was going to be inadequate. It seems more likely that it died than that they willingly chose to leave a fire. And according to Kuryakov, Krivonashenko and Doroshenko, who were the first two to die, were the ones actively collecting firewood for the group. Now, Kuryakov doesn't say what everybody else was doing, just that Krivonashenko and Doroshenko were actively involved in collecting firewood, that as a result of this, they became exhausted and they were unable to make it. And the reason that they climbed 5 meters up into that tree was that the lower branches will be covered with frost and moss and just wouldn't be usable for a fire. At this point then, the remaining hikers divided up the gear from Krivonashenko and Doroshenko's bodies, got as warm as they could, and then split up into 2 groups. And then you get the question, how did the rest of them die? Well, according to Kuryakov, Slobodin, Dyatlov, and Kolmogorova decided that they were going to try and reach the tent. Unfortunately, they quickly succumbed to the freezing temperatures, collapsed, and passed away. Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibault, and Kolevatov, they all went a different direction. They still went south, but they decided to go towards a ravine and make themselves a little den. They stacked snow around the edges and lined the floor with cedar branches to prevent themselves from sitting directly on the snow so they could preserve a little bit more warmth. And then, with spare clothing, they created seats for themselves so that they would have even more protection from the cold, which suggests to us that at this point, staying off the snow was more important than wearing as many clothes as possible, which tells us they probably weren't completely freezing. Because again, they already had the cedar branches. Putting down clothes on top of that wasn't going to do a ton more aside from give them a little bit of comfort. So it tells us that these guys at this point probably were not in immediate danger of freezing to death, or at least they didn't feel that they were in immediate danger of freezing to death. As for how they died, experts suggested that they fell about 3 meters when their den collapsed, and that the rib fractures and the skull fracture sustained by Thibault were all caused by them collapsing onto rocks below them. And then after that, snow would have fallen on top of them, compounding it. In addition to all of this, just the year prior, the Investigative Committee for the Russian Federation had reviewed all of the evidence from 1959, didn't do any new research of their own, just reviewed the evidence that existed. And what they determined was that all of these people in the tent panicked because of an avalanche, cut their way out, and ran down the hill and succumbed to the elements. And in that version of events, the reason that they all have different varying amounts of clothes on is not because there was a methodical taking of the clothes from the dead and reassigning them to the living, but rather because they were just not all in the correct states of undress. They panicked, they threw on whatever they could, and they got down the hill. So that version would have Krivonashenko and Doroshenko dying because they had the fewest clothes on. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin were in the same situation essentially that they were in Kuryakov's version, which is they tried to make it back up the slope to get more clothes, and they failed to and froze to death. The remaining 4, according to that version, went looking for shelter, constructed their den, and then while trying to find something else maybe, they fell into a ravine and died. So far as the Russian authorities are concerned, at least for their purposes, this answered all of the questions. But we're going to look closer, we're going to review everything they said, and of course we got to ask the question, does this all actually hold up? Both the investigative committee version and the prosecutor general's office version of this story have problems right off the bat. Kuryakov's version has it going down as Zolotaryov organizing an orderly evacuation, but the investigative committee's version has them all panicking and running from the tent. It does seem likely that Kuryakov's version of events is the one that's closer to the truth, simply because the footprints suggest it was an orderly evacuation, and in fact, not a panicked withdrawal. The prints leading from the tent to the cedar show a single file line, with the larger of the men, based on the weight and how it impacted their footprints, being the ones walking in the back, likely so that they could make the most easy to follow prints possible in case they needed to return to the tent. Also, one version of events that I found had the footprints beginning about 40 meters away from the tent, suggesting that whatever happened initially, either they were a little bit more scattered at first, or something covered up those footprints that were closer to the tent. In any case, just a little detail there. Part of where I see a problem with this entire avalanche theory, though, is that nobody on the expedition to search for them reported any signs of an avalanche, nobody reported experiencing an avalanche, and on all of the 100+ expeditions to Dyatlov Pass since, nobody has reported an avalanche, or, again, any signs of an avalanche. Additionally, there is disagreement, to put it lightly, on where particularly the tent actually was when it was found in 1959, because while we do have plenty of photos of the tent, we don't have the exact location of the tent. The tree line has changed since 1959 and moved further up the mountain as it's gotten warmer, so it's really hard looking at those photos from 1959 to come up with an exact proper location. You really do have to go out there and replicate photos until you get it right. The result is that there's about 115 meters difference between where the government has placed the tent's location and where independent researchers have placed the tent's location. In either case, the tent was below the same ridge, but even the smallest change in geography can have pretty significant impacts on the outcome of testing for something like this. For example, there was a group of engineers who used the same program as Disney for how they modeled the snow effects in Frozen, and the problem is, if you look at that and you assume that they were in one location, well, you have to run the simulation again in a different location to make sure that you're on track. Essentially, you need to check and make sure that just changing location didn't change the outcome. And then there's the issue of what they left the tent wearing versus what they left behind. And of course, the fact that some of them attempted to return to the tent also gives us some clues to what happened and what they experienced when they were up there, because the decisions they made after the cedar tree have implications. When they left the tent, they left behind 9 parkas, 8 quilted jackets, 1 fur jacket, 2 fur sleeveless vests, 4 pairs of shell pants, 1 pair of cotton pants, 4 scarves, 13 pairs of gloves, 8 pairs of ski boots, 7 pairs of boots, 2 pairs of slippers, 8 pairs of gaiters, 3 caps, 1 fur hat, 2 felt berets, 3 compasses, 1 pocket watch, 3 Finnish-style knives. Those belonging to Thibodeau and Krivonischenko were in their parkas, whereas the one belonging to Kolevatov was recorded as being in its sheath. 3 axes, 19 overboots, 2 buckets, 2 pots, 2 flasks, 1 first aid kit. And then there's an assortment of socks and toiletries. Excluding Thibaut, who was probably on watch at the time all of this went down, and Zolotaryov, who inexplicably was fully dressed, nobody who left the tent that night, which is all of them of course, had proper footwear. Dyatlov, Krivonischenko, Doroshenko, Dubinina, Kolevatov, and Kolmogorova all lacked shoes entirely. Zolotaryov had a pair of handmade but warm leather shoes called burka. Slobodin had 1 felt boot and Thibaut had 2. And you might be thinking, felt boots? Really? That's it? We're not talking about just a little piece of craft felt. These are heavy Russian felt boots. They're called valenki, and they are perfectly suited to this kind of traveling over dry snow. Looking at what they were wearing can also tell us how much time they had to get ready. I wanted to get an idea of how much time they had to prepare for their little outing, which required establishing a baseline for what everybody was wearing when they left the tent in the first place. And it appears that every member of the group left the tent wearing, at the very least, underwear, undershirt, a pair of socks, long underwear or sweatpants, an overshirt, and a sweater or light jacket. The group likely focused from that point, if they had any time to prepare at all, on putting on light jackets and socks, because you can't put a light jacket on over a heavy jacket and you can't put a sock on over a boot. With that covered, we need to divert to the cedar for a moment, because we can't really discuss what was going on with the whole avalanche theory until we understand the circumstances that led to them trying to go back there. Kuryakov argues that the group left the tent and immediately made for the tree line to get out of the open so they would have shelter from the wind. So they walked from the tent to the tree line, and I want to reiterate what that means. He is suggesting that they walked 1.5 kilometers from their tent to the tree line for the purpose of getting out of the wind, and then proceeded to go no further into the forest because they were tired. Forget that being in the trees, even another 10 to 20 meters would have provided them with considerably more protection from the wind, as well as a lot more wood with which to make a fire. Nope, they were just too tired to walk another 30 feet, sat down, and then decided to climb a tree. So I don't think that that was their reason for not going further in. Again, considering the fact that Krivonischenko and Doroshenko then proceeded to climb a tree, but Kuryakov also says they were the first to die because they were tired. I think they didn't go further into the forest for a completely different reason. I think they didn't want to lose sight of the tent. Now, if the tent had been completely buried by an avalanche, I don't think it would matter if they lost sight of the tent, aside from, maybe figuring out their exact position. But figuring out their exact position would probably not involve them climbing the tree at night, because they should have been focused on surviving at that point. So, I think that they intended to get back to the tent before the night ended. Or at the very least, the situation was so dire at the cedar that they felt they were better off expending energy climbing a tree. Again, 5 meters into a tree. That was a better use of their energy than trying to make a fire. It also was very odd to me, the suggestion that they climbed up into a living tree to cut branches to make fire because they couldn't find anything on the ground that was going to be good for making a fire, when anything they found on the ground would have been drier on the inside than a thing they just cut directly off of a tree. Some of the worst wood you can possibly use for starting a fire, especially in a survival situation, is green wood. But anyway, Kuryakov's version of events has it that Krivonischenko and Doroshenko are the ones primarily gathering wood for the group. They become exhausted, they die at the cedar. Now, first of all, why would they be the only ones collecting wood? That makes no sense. But anyway, after Krivonischenko and Doroshenko died for the reason of being cold and tired, after that point, everybody else divided up their clothes and started a new plan of action. Now, before we get to that new plan of action, I want to mention some stuff about Krivonischenko and Doroshenko, which is that I don't believe for a second that they were the only people gathering wood, because again, that makes no sense whatsoever. Nobody was injured yet. So I see no reason to believe that Doroshenko and Krivonischenko were the only people gathering wood, but they are the only people who have injuries consistent with falling out of a tree, which means that they were likely the only people who climbed the tree. And like I said, it's very likely that the rest of the members of the group were also actively looking for wood, so Kuryakov's theory here essentially boils down to Doroshenko and Krivonischenko climbed the tree looking for wood, and became too tired and died. Never mind all of the random bruises that really seem like they fell out of a tree that had nothing to do with it. So that you understand this, the full list of their injuries is as follows. Doroshenko reportedly had burned hair on the right side of his head, blood all over his ears, nose, and eyes, swollen upper lip with dark red hemorrhage, gray foam/liquid coming from his open mouth attributed to pulmonary edema, and pulmonary edema is when there's an abnormal buildup of fluid in the lungs. He had discolored ears, abrasions to the inner shoulder on the right side, as well as 2 cuts without bleeding into the tissue underneath, brown-red bruising on the upper right forearm, swelling and abrasions on the back of the right hand, severe bruising of the tissue surrounding the second metacarpal bone on the right hand, all fingers and toes severely frostbitten, brown-red abrasion on the inner left shoulder, brown-red abrasion on the inner left elbow, surface skin wound on the inner left forearm covered in dried blood, and similar bruises to both shins. Krivonischenko, who was found lying right next to Doroshenko as we know, had bruises on the forehead, bleeding in the right temporal occipital region due to a damaged temporalis muscle, bruised left temporal bone, tip of his nose was missing, likely a post-mortem scavenging incident. He had frostbitten ears. A portion of his own skin from his right hand was found in his mouth. The back of his right hand was swollen, the fingers brown-purple, with the soft tissue around his knuckles a whitish gray. His right hand fingertips were dark brown with minor abrasions to the soft tissue. Right palm was bluish red in color, dark brown skin wound with jagged edges at the base of the thumb. The 4th and 5th fingers of the right hand had a cutaneous wound with hard edges and a charred surface. There was a 2-centimeter scalpel wound to the rear area of his left hand, and yes, that is from the autopsy, but again, the autopsy was translated from Russian, so scalpel wound might not be the best terminology there. Or it could be that the medical examiner looked at it and said, that's a scalpel wound, but also he doesn't come to the conclusion that this was foul play. Then again, he's a medical examiner, that's not necessarily his job. He had a pale red abrasion along the right side of his chest, pale red abrasions along the middle clavicular line at the edge of his ribs, a dark red abrasion on his left wrist, back of the left hand was swollen. He had pink and brown bruise on his left buttock. He had 3 linear lacerations with even edges and a depth of 0.3 centimeters, 1.5 centimeters by 0.4 centimeters in length and width. And yeah, we're just gonna breeze past what sound like claw marks because I couldn't find any reason that those would possibly be there, aside from the obvious, but the obvious doesn't make any sense either because there's no evidence that there was an animal there. He also had 3 cutaneous lacerations on the upper thigh, dark brown abrasion on the front right femur and tibia, a dark brown abrasion on the front inner left thigh, swelling in the left thigh and foot, 31 centimeters by 10 centimeters burn all across his left leg, dark brown abrasions on the right shin, and patches of peeling red-brown epidermal tissue on the back of his left foot, with his second toe charred to brown and dense to the touch. You have no idea how much thinking I did this week.
Yeah, I bet.
So, while the two men absolutely did die of hypothermia, there's a laundry list of injuries that are not accounted for by Kuryakov's model. Kuryakov is likely correct about one specific thing. Krivonischenko and Doroshenko were most likely the only members of the group to climb the tree. I say that because there are injuries specific to this pair. Only Doroshenko and Krivonischenko have injuries consistent with climbing into and falling out of a tree. They were both covered in bruises to an extent far beyond anybody else in the group, and many of those bruises were long and narrow, like branches. There are, of course, members of the group that made it to the den who have injuries that could be consistent with falling from a high height out of a tree, but if they had sustained them at the cedar, they never would have made it to the den. They would have died. And both men had damage to their torsos consistent with falling between branches. The question then becomes not how did they die, but why did they and they alone fall out of the tree? We can't assume with certainty that they were the only ones to climb the tree. This is because they only have injuries associated with falling, not climbing. However, we also can't assume that everyone climbed the tree. I say that because there's a number of theories here that involve the idea that everybody climbed the tree, and the reasoning there is that they were trying to escape something on the ground. Absent any evidence that everybody climbed the tree, it seems most likely that those two did it, and that they did it for the purpose of getting a better view. In any case, this appears to have been a game-changing moment. A lot of sources suggest the reason for the various states of undress was paradoxical undressing, something that occurs as the body goes into hypothermia, where you start to feel very, very warm as your body is desperately trying to keep you alive in your last moments. So, a lot of people who are found dead of hypothermia will have stripped off various items of clothing. We've actually talked about this on a few occasions in relation to the missing 411 phenomenon, but that's not what happened here. This was deliberate. They took the clothes off of the dead bodies of Krivonischenko and Doroshenko so that they themselves had a better chance of surviving. They were not all hypothermic at this point, just those two. From there, it's unclear what happened regarding that course of action, because one group headed for the tent and the other group did not head for the tent. The group split in two, and it's not totally clear to anybody why, because again, we don't have any journal entries, there's no video, no audio. We can just go based off of what 9 people left in their midst as they died. Additionally, part of the reason we know that they split, and not that they all went up to the tent together, lost 3 members of the group, and decided to descend, was due to the state of Kolmogorova, Dyatlov, and Slobodin. There are also some factors that we'll get to later in the video that tie into this, but right now I just want to point out the clothing. Had all 7 of the remaining members of the group attempted to reach the tent together, they probably would have stripped the bodies as people fell, but they didn't do that, which means that Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova probably were the only 3 to make for the tent. So in that case, why did they split, and could it have had to do with what caused them to leave the tent? Something caused them to abandon the tent quickly enough to forego boots, gloves, and heavy jackets. So whatever they were worried about, the danger must have been fairly immediate. On the other hand, it has to have been something that was less dangerous than remaining out in the cold without the proper clothing, or something that was only temporarily dangerous. They also may have initially intended to go for their storage cache where they had additional gear, sleeping bags, tools, food. But it's possible that in the darkness with whatever was going on around them, they simply got disoriented or confused and went north instead of south. In both cases, they would be going downhill. In fact, it's possible that when Krivonischenko and Doroshenko got up into that tree, they weren't even looking for the tent. They may have been looking for the storage cache. They may not have realized that they were in the wrong place yet. So splitting up may have been a disagreement, but splitting up might have also been a division of labor issue. They might have had one group go to the tent to try and get more clothes, blankets, some survival gear, some tools, some food, while the other group constructed a shelter further below. So to understand what happened here further, because again, we have very little evidence on its face to look at, we have to look at the injuries to the Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin group. Igor Dyatlov was found on his back, his head facing towards the tent, with his arms across his chest like this, almost looking as if he was yelling. And he had the following injuries: minor abrasions to the forehead, minor abrasions to the upper eyelid, brown-red abrasions to the left eyebrow, minor abrasions to the left cheek, brown-red abrasions on both cheeks, Dried blood on the lips. Lower jaw was missing an incisor, but it appeared to be an older injury or something that was extracted years prior. Bruises on his knees, surface level only. Reddish-brown abrasions on both ankles with bleeding into the underlying tissue. One laceration near those scratches, and one graze toward the lower tibia. Lots of small scratches on the lower third of the right forearm and on the palm. Purple-gray discoloration of the back of the right hand. Bruised knuckles consistent with fist fighting. Brown-purple left hand with brownish-red bruising. Yes, keep in mind that I mentioned fist fighting. Superficial wounds to the second and fifth fingers on the left hand. An irregular linear skin wound on the palm surface of the second and fifth fingers on the left hand, 0.1 to 0.2 centimeters deep. The next person they found, of course, was Kolmogorova, who was found on her right side with the following injuries. Dark red abrasion to the forehead, right side, pale gray skin above the right eyebrow, dark red abrasion to the upper eyelids, brown-red graze on the bridge and tip of the nose, numerous abrasions on the right cheekbone, bruised skin on the right side of the face, bruised knuckles, jagged-edged wound with missing skin to the back of the right hand, base of the third finger, frostbitten fingertips, and a 26 by 6 centimeter, that's 10 inch by 2.3 inch, long, bright red abrasion on the lower back and left side. And finally, Slobodin was face down with one arm flung out to the side and the other balled in front of him, as though he'd been running mid-stride when he froze. Of course, he was also face down in the snow. And he was found with hemorrhages in both temples, minor abrasions on the forehead, two 1.5 centimeter long scratches 0.3 centimeters apart on his forehead, brownish red bruises on the upper eyelid of his left eye with hemorrhaging into the underlying tissue, traces of blood in his nose, swelling and small abrasions to both sides of the face, bruised knuckles again, brown bruises on the left forearm and palm, again interesting, that's another matching injury, swollen lips, bruises on the left tibia, epidermis torn from the right forearm, and of course it is perfectly valid to ask the question, how did that occur while he was fully clothed without tearing through the clothes as well? And finally, he had a 6 centimeter fracture to the frontal bone of the skull. Looking at all of that, some oddities become apparent rather quickly. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, and Krivonischenko all had bruised knuckles. And Doroshenko had pretty bad bruising to his right hand on the knuckle as well. None of the four at the den had bruised knuckles. All 5 of them had bruised knuckles. While it's not certain that those would have come from a fist fight, it is a little weird to have that many people with bruises all over their faces and torsos, as well as bruised knuckles. And when I say that it wasn't just the bruised knuckles, that's because Dyatlov had bruised knuckles as well as abrasions to the forehead, the upper eyelid, the left eyebrow, and both cheeks. Kolmogorova had bruised knuckles, abrasions to the right forehead, upper eyelids, nose, left shoulder, right cheek, and a long bruised area on her back and side, as well as a jagged flesh wound on the right hand's backside. Slobodin, of course, had bruised knuckles, many abrasions on the face, a bloody nose, abrasions on the forehead, and swollen lips, while Krivonischenko had bruised knuckles, but then again he also fell out of a tree, and Doroshenko had a single bruised knuckle. So Kolmogorova, Slobodin, and Dyatlov definitely have a lot of injuries consistent with a fist fight. Krivonischenko and Doroshenko, it's a little iffy. And then there's the irregular linear skin wound on Dyatlov's second and fifth fingers. To me, that does sound a little bit like he went and used his hand to block a knife or a sharpened branch. And talking about the knives brings up another issue. As far as the entire process goes, there had to have been knives at the cedar and at the den, but 3 knives were found in the tent in parkas and sheaths, and then a pocket knife was found in Dyatlov's parka back at the tent. No other knives were found, and as far as determining who actually had knives, it seems like it's possible that nobody else had knives. Certainly none of the other bodies had knives on them. Further weirdness includes the odd wound on Slobodin's right forearm. 2 patches of skin were missing, measuring 2.5 by 3 centimeters and 3 by 1 centimeters. And that could be explicable if not for the fact that the wound was on his forearm, but none of the clothes over the wound were torn. So that means it wasn't scavenging. He obtained that wound while he was alive, possibly before even getting dressed. But as we said, it seems like everybody in the group was sleeping in a certain amount of clothing, which would likely have included longer sleeves. Additionally, Dyatlov's position doesn't make sense. He died of hypothermia, and yet he had an unbuttoned jacket with no signs of paradoxical undressing otherwise. And he also died in an active position, his hands across his chest as if he was trying to rip something off. And then there's Slobodin's head wound, which is not explained. The autopsy suggests that the head wound was a result of falling onto rock or ice, but Slobodin fell onto deep snow, and there's no evidence that he fell out of a tree. The wound was also too severe to have been caused by a fist or a knee. Either he was struck with a heavy stick or rock, or struck himself with a heavy stick or rock, but around his body, there were no heavy sticks or rocks with which to strike himself. So that kind of implies that either he started this trek with a head wound from tripping, or that he didn't have the head wound when he started the trek back up to the tent. And as stated, the autopsy suggests a fall, but simply says a blunt object was responsible for it. In the same vein, the long bruise along Kolmogorova's back and side is not explained by simply falling into the snow, and she also has no other injuries consistent with falling out of the tree. And many have pointed out that Kolmogorova's bruise appears like one that might have been caused by a baton being pressed against her, as if during an interrogation. And then there's some more weirdness. Both Kolmogorova and Slobodin showed signs of being moved after their deaths, but Dyatlov didn't. This is a problem because Dyatlov was the first to die, and he's the only one that doesn't show signs of being moved. Slobodin would have died between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova, but Kolmogorova would not have stopped to reposition his body without taking any of his clothes for herself, and there was no one to reposition Kolmogorova. Now, in the interest of being fair and presenting all of the evidence, the reason that it was suggested that they were moved after death was that the livor mortis spots, basically the blood pooling in their body after death, was not in the correct position for where it should have been had they died in the position they were found. For example, Slobodin had livor mortis spots on his back, but if he died in the position he was found on his face, then he should not have had them on his back. They should have been on his front. I will also be transparent about the fact that when it comes to the medical stuff, I am kind of relying on what the medical people said, because I don't know what most of this means. But with all of those people dead on their way up to the tent, it brings us to yet another question. Why did they go for the tent? One possibility is that it had in fact been an avalanche, which meant that the danger had passed, and if they could reach the tent, they had a good chance of survival. But if it had been an avalanche, why would they go back for something that could very easily be completely covered in snow? And if something other than an avalanche had driven them from the tent, what could that be? A fire has been suggested, considering that they did have the portable camping stove, but nothing was burned inside of the tent. But whatever had driven them from the tent, they must have believed they had a better chance of surviving an encounter with that than they did just staying out in the open by the cedar. Or, assuming they had a conversation with the others, crafting a den. Alternatively, they might not have had a choice because they may have been attacked by something at the cedar. And some of the evidence and the argument for the avalanche theory does stem from the very existence of that second group at the den. The den group had chosen not to go for the tent, instead walking about 50 meters south of the cedar, where they dug out some snow, put some cedar branches, and constructed a little shelter for themselves. If it had been an avalanche, there was very little chance of recovering anything useful from the tent, and there was the consideration that they would have to make the trek back down as well, which, even if they survived getting up to the tent, they might not survive getting back down from the tent. And the futility of such an attempt to reach the tent is also supported by the fact that the best dressed of the group, Thibaut and Zolotaryov, decided they were not shooting for the tent. They were not going along for that. They did not need to. They were safer down there. And that could be because they had the most clothes and simply decided, I'm risking my life more going to the tent. And in their case, what was going to the tent going to achieve for them? They might get some food, but they also might die on their way there. And then, of course, it could simply be that all of them decided they stood to gain too little and it wasn't worth the risk. Group 2 also answers a few questions while creating some of its own. They did return to the cedar a number of times to collect branches from it, which tells us that they probably weren't attacked by something there. Additionally, Dubinina was wearing Krivonashenko's sweater, which tells us that they were all at the cedar together and that they did, in fact, strip the dead for their clothes. The fact that they even decided to build a shelter tells us that they were still in a stable state of mind, and had the group died of hypothermia, it would basically be case closed here, but that's not what happened. 3 of the 4 members of the Den group had a cause of death other than hypothermia, with Kolevatov being the odd man out. Dubinina was the first of that group to be found on May 5th, 1959, and in her position she was kind of kneeling over a natural rock ledge. Her injuries were as follows. The soft tissue around her eyes, eyebrows, and nose bridge were missing, and a portion of her left cheekbone was exposed. The tissue around her left temporal bone was damaged, her eye sockets were empty, her eyeballs completely missing. Her nose was not broken, but the cartilage was. The soft tissue of the upper lip was missing, the teeth and upper jaw were exposed. Her tongue was also missing. Ribs 2, 3, 4, and 5 were broken on the right side. Ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 were broken on the left side. There was a massive hemorrhage into the heart's right atrium, and she had a bruise on the middle of her left thigh. Her cause of death was listed as massive hemorrhage into her heart, multiple rib fractures, and internal bleeding, and this was the result of an impact of great force to her chest. One of the sweaters she was wearing was radioactive, and it also belonged to Krivonischenko. And as we mentioned in the previous video, they were all found in a stream in a ravine. Thibault was found face down in that ravine. Kolmogorova, it seems, was directly below him on the ledge. Thibault was also best dressed of the group and had the fewest injuries of anyone involved. And yet, compared to most members of the group, he died very violently. He had multiple fractures to the temporal bone on the right side of his skull, radiating about 40 to 45 millimeters from a central impact point, with one fracture line extending all the way down the forehead. There was a tissue defect in the cheek of irregular shape, and a hemorrhage in the right shoulder. His cause of death was trauma to the brain caused by whatever caused the trauma to his skull. The autopsy suggests it's the result of a fall, and though he may not have died immediately, he was likely unconscious for the remainder of his life. The exact wording from the autopsy is that the injuries were caused by a great force with the subsequent falling, hurling, and concussion of Thibault. The remaining one to have traumatic injury was Zolotaryov, and he was found in the arms of Kolevatov, who was behind him and above him in the ravine. His eyeballs were missing, the soft tissue was missing from his left eyebrow area, there was a soft tissue defect in the right temporal area, and he had a flail chest with ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 broken on the right side. Finally, Kolevatov, as I mentioned, seemed to be holding Zolotaryov as if to keep him warm or protect him from something. He was missing tissue from around his eyes, his eyebrows were completely missing, and his skull was exposed. His nose also was not broken, but the cartilage was. There was a tissue defect in the cheek with the jawbone exposed, a tissue defect behind the ear, deformed but not broken neck, diffuse bleeding into the soft tissue of the left knee, bath skin on the hands and feet, so basically his hands and feet had been soaking for a while, and overall his skin was reportedly a grayish-green color with a purple tinge. His cause of death is listed as hypothermia, with all of those other injuries being post-mortem. With this group, there are a few things to address that are often presented as being very mysterious that aren't really as mysterious as they seem to be. For example, Kolevatov's sweater and pants, as well as the sweater being worn by Dubinina that belonged to Krivonischenko, were all radioactive. It was very mildly radioactive, and both Kolevatov and Krivonischenko worked with radioactive materials in their daily lives. However, the radiologists working on the case determined that the levels of radiation were above those that would be typical for people who just work with these materials day to day. They therefore concluded that this contamination occurred due to dust in the air, radioactive dust, not their working with plutonium. It should be mentioned that if you look at the actual readings of what the levels of radiation were, you're going to see a more mild amount than was likely present when they died, simply because they were sitting in running water for a long period of time, which meant that the radioactive material was constantly being rinsed away from their clothes, so they probably had more radioactive material on their clothing when they passed away. Is that relevant to how they died? Not necessarily. Most of the group was also missing soft tissue. Dubinina was missing her eyes and tongue, Zolotaryov his eyes, and Kolevatov, as well as the aforementioned, were both missing tissue from around the eyes and brow areas. Now you may be thinking, isn't skin falling off also a bit of a symptom of radiation poisoning? Yes, but they did not have enough radiation to be suffering the effects of acute radiation poisoning. But all 4 Den members also had bath skin and tissue defects, while the rest of the group had no such injuries. This, of course, is explicable because those are the only 4 that were found in running water. Everybody else was further up the mountain or closer to the tree line and frozen. It was likely the running water that caused a lot of these tissue defects and missing tissues, as well as there being the possibility of animal scavenging for things like the eyes and the tongue. What's a little bit harder to explain is the group's major injuries as well as their decision making. First of all, after separating from Dyatlov's group, for whatever reason they did so, they left the tree line to build the den. This could be because they felt that digging out a shelter was going to be easier than constructing one, but we can't know for sure. The problem here is that no tools were discovered by the cedar or by the den, and they must have used knives to cut the branches. But like we said, the knives are kind of an issue. When the tent was discovered at the end of February, all of the finished knives, those owned by Kolevatov, Tibo, and Krivanashenko, one of the two Shenkos, those ones were all reportedly in the tent in February. The only other knife found was Dyatlov's pocket knife, which was also in the tent. So, how could they have cut the branches without any knives? Moving on to another weird thing, while radioactive dust would explain why Krivanashenko and Kolevatov had radioactive clothing, it does not explain why nobody else in the group had radioactive clothing. It is possible that they could have all passed through an area with radioactive dust and only Kolevatov and Krivanashenko actually accrued any, but that's also extremely unlikely. It's also possible that they acquired the radiation at the den and that it was never on Krivanashenko, it was only on Dubinina wearing Krivanashenko's stuff, but then that doesn't explain the absence of radioactive material from either Zolotaryov or Tibo. There's also the fact that they made a den at all. If the tent was accessible, why not send the best dressed members up there? Could be that the best dressed members refused to go, but up to this point, they'd shown pretty good cohesion as a team, and it seems unlikely that people would have just started saying no out of the blue at a time like this. And then there's the other possibility, that the tent wasn't accessible, but if the tent wasn't accessible, why send 3 people up there in the first place? The choice to both send people to the tent as well as build a den implies that either there was disagreement in the group between Dyatlov's crew and Zolotaryov's crew, or that the tent was accessible but too damaged to be usable, so sending one group up to get supplies while the other constructed a shelter was the best plan. Thing is, that doesn't sound like the result of an avalanche, but it also doesn't sound like the result of a terrifying monster. Whatever drove them from the tent, they left rapidly, in an organized manner, and seemingly with the intent to return. However, they also went the wrong direction, and so they were either blocked from going south to their storage cache, were confused about which direction they were going, or inexplicably chose not to look for the storage cache. And most curious of all are the injuries here. Dubinino had a crushed chest, Tibo had a major skull fracture, and the entire right side of Zolotaryov's ribs were broken. When Vozrozdinye, the medical examiner who was in charge of conducting all of these autopsies, was interviewed, he did have answers to questions about these. Regarding Tibo, he said that his injuries were the result of throwing, fall, or jettisoning of the body, and he did not believe that those injuries could simply be caused by Tibo falling from his own height, just falling over. Essentially, it wasn't that Tibo just slipped, rolled his ankle, and hit his head on a rock. He fell several meters. In fact, he compares the injury to being hit by a car at high speed. He essentially says that Tibo either fell or was thrown off of a ledge and then hit his head on the rock or ice below. He also was asked if it was possible that someone simply just hit Tibo in the head with a rock, but he said no. And when asked how long Tibo might have survived, he said that it was possible he lived 2 to 3 more hours, but he would have been unconscious and basically impossible to move. He was also asked what could have caused the injuries to Dubinina and Zolotaryov, and if they could have been the same cause. He did not directly answer the second question, but he did answer the first question. He notes that the injuries were similar. We're dealing with hemorrhaging into the cardiac muscle and pleural cavity as a result of blunt force trauma and subsequent fracture of the ribs. And while Zolotaryov may have lived a little while, hour or so, Dubinina was likely dead 10 to 20 minutes after her injury. It does seem he was not asked about Kolevatov, which poses a problem for Kuryakov's version of events. Because Kuryakov was claiming that the entire den group died together of the same general cause. So first, let's kind of describe the den we're dealing with here. When found, it sat at a depth of 3.5 meters beneath the top of the snow, and it was discovered after Mansi hunters came across a set of Dubinina's clothing, as well as what appeared to be a trail of fir branches leading directly into a snowbank. It was built 50 meters from the cedar and about 6 meters from a ravine. The den itself consisted of 14 fir branches laid out in about a 3 square meter area, with piles of clothes set up as seats on the edges. And of course, the clothes and the branches were there and organized in a manner to make sure that they were getting as much distance between them and the snow as possible. And I will say, looking at images of it, it's decidedly small for 7 people, which would lend to the theory that they were having a disagreement and they did not expect Dyatlov and his people to come back, but it could also be that they simply didn't have enough materials and planned to cuddle anyway. Additionally, 15 meters from the den were found a spoon and a knife sheath, but no knife. It should also be mentioned that the exact location of the den is not known for certain, because once again, nobody recorded any specific coordinates, so I can give you the general meters between things, but I can't tell you precisely where everything was. And according to Kuryakov's version of events, the 4 remaining hikers sitting in their den fell down at least 2 meters into a ravine 6 meters away from them. So, and I mean this, he says that the den collapsed and they fell 2 meters. 6 meters away. So it's like they glitched. Like they both fell down and sideways at the same time. And the den is, to be clear, to confirm this, according to the people who found it, a depth of 2.5 to 3 meters beneath the surface of the snow, 6 meters from the bodies, which themselves were at a depth of 2 to 2.5 meters. This means that the difference between the level of the den and the level at which the bodies were found was no more than 3 feet. A 0.5 meter to 1 meter fall, even if it were directly onto rocks, would not cause the sort of injuries that we see with Zolotaryov and Dubinina, and it certainly would not prevent Kolevatov from getting up. So, with all of that info now presented, let's go re-examine the official story. According to the Russians, someone spotted an avalanche, the entire group left the tent with such urgency that they didn't put boots on, and also sliced the tent open to escape, hiked 1.5 kilometers in the wrong direction, despite being of sound mind enough to walk single file downhill, built a fire but only had 2 people help collect firewood for it, and climb the tree. Those 2 died, so the group split. One group made for the now totally snow-covered tent 1.5 kilometers uphill in high winds and impossibly cold temperatures, and died of exposure. The other group built a den and then died by falling 6 meters horizontally and then 1 meter down. All of this was done with disappearing knives. Now, personally, I don't love that story, so let's dig into the theories. Our first theory: leaving the tent was the result of an imminent avalanche. There were no signs of an avalanche. Avalanches are rare in that area. They tried to go back, they left going the wrong way, and they knew better than to camp where an avalanche was likely to occur. For so many reasons, I don't like the avalanche theory, not least of which is the fact that a lot of people who hear about the avalanche theory think it explains how they died, not just why they left the tent. It literally only explains why they left the tent, and then you could kind of extrapolate that, well, it explains how they died because they died of hypothermia, except for the ones that didn't die of hypothermia and all of the many injuries they had that were not consistent with dying of hypothermia. Now again, I'm not going to argue that what eventually killed most of these people was in fact hypothermia, it's just there's a number of other factors to be considered here. And that is part of the reason why so many alternatives to the avalanche theory exist. Obviously, I can't list all of them here, but I picked a few to go through because some of them I really like. But the ones I really like still have some issues. One of the most popular theories is that all of this was caused by katabatic winds. Katabatic winds occur when air moves over the top of a mountain and then rapidly descends a slope. This can reach speeds of 80 meters per second, and back in 1978, a group of hikers in Sweden were killed by katabatic winds moving at only 20 meters per second. In this scenario, the Dyatlov group would have noticed what was going on, left the tent, covered it in snow to weigh it down and lower the profile, and gone down the mountain to wait out the gusts. This does explain why they left, why the tent was still intact for the most part, and it also explains how they may have become disoriented and gone the wrong direction. High winds would of course be blowing snow everywhere, it would become easy to be confused and lost, and you could just end up walking the wrong way. But what it doesn't explain is why they took so little with them. If it was just wind, and I know that these are very speedy winds, but if we're not talking about thousands of pounds of snow barreling down on you, we're just talking about gusts of wind that you recognize are dangerous, you probably have a little bit more time to at the very least throw on a parka. Another suggestion was that they had panic induced by infrasound. Infrasound is defined as any sound beneath 20 hertz, and it has been known to cause nausea, disorientation, fear, and anxiety in certain situations. If you're curious about whether or not this works, you can simply ask the Taliban. Now, this would explain why they had to leave the tent. It explains why they left the tent so rapidly, and it explains why they would have attempted to return. Once they realized what was going on, that they weren't in any immediate danger, it was just a weird vibe, they could go back to the tent. The problem is that the evidence suggests they did not panic as they left the tent. They walked in an orderly single file line down the hill, a bunch of people panicking would probably not walk in a straight line. And then of course there's the idea that maybe the stove fell on top of them, which is one of the most practical reasons that a whole bunch of people would file out of the tent really quickly. It explains that, it explains the lack of clothes, and it even explains some of the group's injuries. However, if there were a fire, the tent would likely have burned and there would be nothing left in it. There were also no burn marks on the tent, and it doesn't explain how they got disoriented and headed down the mountain going the wrong direction. Next up is the cedar issue and the first deaths. Krivonashenko and Doroshenko were the first to die, and it's allegedly because they were the ones looking for firewood and they became exhausted. I think that doesn't make much sense because everyone would have been involved either in getting wood or doing something productive or treating somebody who was injured. So once again, we have to look at the other theories. Some people suggest that there was a lightning bolt that struck the tree while Krivonashenko and Doroshenko were on it, which knocked them off of the tree and eventually caused them to die. The problem is that electrocution was just not even remotely considered during the autopsy because there was simply no evidence of it. They had none of the burn marks that would be consistent with electrocution. Also, the cedar tree would have itself probably been burned. I would wager that they climbed up that tree to get a view of where the tent was, which again is also anti-avalanche because it would suggest that they were trying to get back to the tent as soon as possible and that it wasn't expected that the tent would be covered in snow. And then they eventually fell out of the tree for some reason or another. Maybe they just grabbed onto some ice and slipped, and they just passed away because they were in a lot of pain and simply gave in to exhaustion. And then there's the unexplained split in the group. Kuryakov gives no explanation for why the group split up, just says that they did, and as we've established, there's really two essential possibilities. The group may have agreed that the tent was probably intact, probably contained useful materials, and that they would split up, send one group to go retrieve things from the tent, and the other group would get started making a den. This does explain why they split, it tracks pretty well with what we know, and it's a rational choice. Sending the entire group up to the tent was never a good option. Splitting the group wasn't a great option, but it was one of two crappy options with different possible outcomes. It also explains why Kolmogorova and Slobodin kept going even after Dyatlov died. They weren't doing this for themselves, they were doing it for the entire group. Perhaps only one of them actually needed to make it to the tent. It doesn't explain, however, why Thibaut and Zolotaryov, the two best dressed of the group, were not amongst those who agreed to go up. It's also odd that, considering that once they were in the den, it seemed that they didn't need to be wearing all of the clothing they had, since they were able to make cushions out of some of it, and some of it was discarded in the area. They probably could have given clothes to the other group, and yet they chose not to if this was the case, that they did make an agreement that half the group was going to go for the tent. The other possibility is that the group disagreed on going to the tent and split in two. This would explain why they separated, as well as why Kolmogorova and Slobodin continued on to the tent after Dyatlov died. They simply might have felt that they were unwelcome back at the den, and this was their only option going forward. Maybe they would be welcomed back if they brought back supplies. And it would also explain why gear wasn't shared. If they were angry at each other and Zolotaryov and Thibaut said this is a stupid idea, you shouldn't be doing it, they might not be willing to share gear. However, this was an experienced and professional group, and they likely would have known and understood that their best chances were if they worked together. So splitting up like that seems like a really good way to make sure everyone doesn't make it. On top of that, they were in very good spirits on the night of the 1st, even creating a satirical combat leaflet like they were at the front. It talks about things like philosophical lectures on love and the Yeti being in the area. That's actually where the Yeti theory seems to have come from, is that they made a joke about the Yeti being there. So, you know how it goes. There's a record for assembling a stove. It's just very clear that they're trying to keep themselves in good spirits. And then finally, there's the deaths at the den. Kuryakov chalks it up to a simple fall, but I don't think that that quite does it justice. The elevation difference between the den and where their bodies were found, as I said, was only 0.5 meters to a meter, so 1.5 to 3 feet or so. On top of that, the spot where their bodies were found is 6 meters away. So Kuryakov's explanation that the den collapsed and they fell really doesn't make sense. It doesn't work because the den couldn't collapse half a meter downward and kill them the way it did. It also couldn't collapse half a meter downward and deposit them 6 meters, which again, about 3 feet to a meter, so we're talking about a little over 18 feet here, almost 20 feet. They weren't gonna slide that far away, because if you look at the position of their bodies, and I can't show you the position of their bodies, I can maybe draw you a diagram, but I can't show the actual bodies on YouTube, obviously. But if you look at it, it really does look like they were deposited there. Either they fell there or somebody placed them there. They certainly did not fall out of the den onto where they were found. And there's more problems other than just the fact that that's not enough distance to kill somebody. Why were they all standing outside of the den at the same time? Why were they all standing so close together? And how did they manage to fall hard enough in just a meter to destroy their own chests and skulls? And if that's what happened, if that all of that was caused by a fall, how is it that Kolevatov ended up dying of hypothermia with no major injuries? Now, you might be sitting here going, all right, Aiden, give it to us. Tell us the real unexpected answer here. I'm not going to, because I don't have one. It's not just that what I thought was going to be a 20 or 30 minute video turned into 2 weeks worth of content. It's that there is so much information here that I would have to spend more weeks, like several more weeks, digging through every single piece of information out there on this topic, all of the documentation from the investigation, for me to even come close to being able to present you an account of everything that happened. There's other weird things going on here. Photographs that suggest that maybe things weren't as rosy as they seemed. Differences in the accounting of how many cameras were present. Yuri Yudin, the survivor, his testimony changing over the years in a few different ways. Testimony from the searchers that suggests that, you know what, it really seemed like the Russian government was just trying to say case closed here. We've got a lot of different stuff out there that I just wasn't going to be able to cover in a video that was purely trying to tell you all of the major information and the way the details connected. What I can say is I'm pretty confident that an avalanche did not account for all of these deaths. I don't think an avalanche is the best explanation for why they left the tent. An avalanche does not explain why they went back. There are just far too many issues with the avalanche theory. Personally, I actually do like the katabatic wind theory a lot more, even though I'm still not convinced, obviously, as I said in the video. But if I were to take a stab at explaining what happened here, I still don't have a solid answer for why they left the tent. All I know is that whatever caused them to leave the tent, it seems that either Zolotaryov and Thibault had advanced notice of it, or that for some reason the two of them were both fully dressed, and everybody else was only wearing what they were going to wear to sleep. Whatever caused them to leave the tent, I don't think that they had time to do anything other than maybe pull on the nearest pair of socks and whatever jacket was right next to them in case they needed to pee. I think that they probably left that tent with the intention of going to their storage shed, and instead got disoriented, sidetracked, something was in their way. Again, not enough information to say what that could have been, and they went down to the cedar. Now, one of the problems here is that Zolotaryov's body was found with a camera on it, and nobody's really sure why Zolotaryov would have been holding a camera for no particular reason, also fully dressed, while everybody else except the guy on watch was inside the tent. There are a number of possibilities, a number of theories there that I can't get into in this video, but when we re-release this as a unified single-part video, good news! It's gonna have this additional stuff in it, so you will get new content. It won't just be this and part one pasted together. There will be additional stuff that we follow up on later on. So, fun little teaser for what you're gonna get sometime later this year. When they did make their way down to the cedar, I think that they realized they were in the wrong place and decided they needed to find the tent, hence why they climbed the tree. I think because Doroshenko and Krivonischenko climbed so high in that tree, and it was so cold and nobody had gloves, they simply lost their grip and fell out of the tree, at which point they were in so much pain from being bruised in so many places all over their bodies that they simply just gave in. I think that it was probably Dyatlov and Zolotaryov who decided to split up the group, with Dyatlov saying, I'm in charge of the expedition, putting the tent up there was my job, I'm gonna be the one that goes for it. I think because he and Kolmogorova were such good friends, she decided to accompany him. I don't necessarily have an idea why Slobodin went. It might have just been that he said, yeah, I'll go. I think Zolotaryov was the one who suggested building a den because he had the military experience and this would be something that they were taught in basic training. What I can't explain about this section of the issue is the injuries to Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova. I don't understand why they all have bruised knuckles. It really does seem like there was a fist fight, but I can't place where the fist fight would be or how it works into this. Because if it were a fist fight with the group that went to the den, then you would expect that those people would also have bruised knuckles and bruises all over their faces and torsos. But instead they don't, which is very weird to me. I still can't wrap my head around the bruised knuckles. I also don't totally understand why it looks like Slobodin was running when he died, and why it looks like Dyatlov was trying to rip open a shirt, which, if you look at the position of his hands, they're not wrapped around a shirt, they're just like this over his chest. So I don't totally understand what that is either. I don't have a good answer for it. Maybe I will when we get to the unified version of the video. And I'm still puzzled by Slobodin's injury. I wonder when he got it. As for the Den group, that's another weird one to me. And this is why I wonder about the possibility of something being covered up here, whether we're talking about an attack by natives that the Russian government wanted to cover up so that they didn't have to deal with some ethnic conflict, or whether we're talking about somebody in the group going nuts, or we're talking about Bigfoot. I don't particularly know, but there are some injuries here that really can't be explained, like that fracture to Slobodin's head, like the level of crushed ribs on Dubinina and Zolotaryov. And when we look at the Den, it doesn't make sense that the spot those people were found was so far away from the den they built. Why did they leave it? What was the point of that? Did something drive them from it? Was it collapsing? You know, how did that end up happening? And how, if you, again, looking at this, the snowy landscape would have had to be so much different that it's, I mean, the current landscape, when you look at the photos, it is not possible that they died the way it was suggested in that spot. There just was not enough room for them to fall. We're talking, again, about 0.5 meters to a meter of elevation difference. So, like I said, when it comes to the Dyatlov Pass incident, it drives me insane that there's so many people out there saying it's been solved, it's been explained, it was just an avalanche. But at the same time, it drives me nuts when people think there's a neat little explanation like a Yeti or UFOs or a missile test, because there's simply far too much going on here for it to just be any of those things. Although the coroner did say that the injuries to Dubinina and Zolotaryov were in fact consistent with the shockwave from a bomb. But again, more on that later. Little hint at part 3. There's just no explanation, be it natural, supernatural, human-caused, complete accident, that neatly wraps everything up with a bow. And that's why I think Dyatlov Pass is such an interesting mystery, and something that we can still revisit every few years, that people can still talk about, take a new angle at, take a new look at it. Because the fact of the matter is, I'm sure there was stuff in here that I saw that other people didn't. I'm sure there are things that other people see that I don't. And the more we talk about it, the more we compare notes, the closer we get to coming up with an actual final explanation for what is honestly one of the 20th century's most interesting mysteries. When we first covered Dyatlov Pass back in 2023, there were just a few loose ends left over after we had finished up. We were left with questions like, who was this Semyon Zolotaryov really, and was there some sort of ulterior motive for his being on that trip? Also, there's all these unknown pictures and unknown diaries where we don't know who took them, who wrote them, so could these be important to what happened in the end? There were also a few more kind of out there, so to speak, theories that we didn't really have time to cover. Things like, was this a secret military test? Were there hostile natives? Or could this have even been some sort of Yeti-like creature? We felt that these things simply deserved a much closer look, and so that's what we did. And from there, you probably know the story, or at least the basics. For some reason, they left the tent, they headed down the mountain to the tree line, started a fire, and then people just seem to have started to die. Krivonischenko and Doroshenko went first, at which point the group seems to have split up. Dyatlov taking Kolmogorova and Slobodin up to the tent, probably to try and get their axes, their clothes, just some more stuff to help them survive the night. Meanwhile, Zolotaryov took at the very least Thibaut Bernol, as well as Dubinina, down into a ravine to get out of the wind and build a den. He may have also taken Alexander Kolevatov with him, although if Krivonischenko and Doroshenko were still alive at this point, it's possible that Kolevatov stayed with them until he heard something happen. Dyatlov's team unfortunately died of hypothermia on their way up the mountain. Meanwhile, Zolotaryov's team was able to get down into the ravine and dig out an entire den complete with a floor that they constructed out of cedar boughs, only to then die of massive crush injuries about 6 meters away. And in part 2 of this series, we went into detail about what injuries everyone had, how they might have transpired, and what the sort of weird aspects were. Like, for example, some of the group that was going up the mountain had lividity that couldn't be explained. It was that they were face down, but they had lividity on the rear side, things like that. But what really puzzled us in that video, the thing that genuinely seemed totally inexplicable, was the injuries to Zolotaryov, Dubinina, and Thibaut Bernol, who for the rest of this video, I'm going to refer to as Thibaut. Both Dubinina and Zolotaryov had multiple, I think 6 or 7 ribs crushed, each on one side of their chest. The injuries to Dubinina likely killed her immediately, whereas Zolotaryov may have clung to life for another 30 minutes to an hour. As for Thibaut, his was a head injury. It was a severe head injury and likely left him comatose, but would have taken a while to kill him, most likely. The fourth member of the group found dead in the den was actually Klevetov, but Klevetov didn't really have injuries. It seemed that most of the wounds he had were surface level, and then whatever killed him seems to have been hypothermia, but he was also found breast to back with Zolotaryov, almost as if he was trying to keep him warm. And like I said, we went into the details of what we found weird here and what we didn't find weird and the reasons for both in part 2. I don't have time to go through that right now, but if you're interested in that, that's very much available. What we wanted to talk about right here is what we really felt like was the remaining mystery, which was, how did the group at the den actually die? We know it wasn't an avalanche because whatever destroyed the tent, it didn't kill them. We know it wasn't hypothermia for those at the den because they simply died of wounds, injuries. And while they were found beneath a small ledge about 6 meters from the den, that ledge was only a 2-meter drop, and it's just extremely unlikely, near impossible, that a fall like that, even directly onto the rocks, would cause this extensive of an injury. Thibaut, with the head injury, perhaps. That could make sense as to how he died. But as for Dubinina and Zolotaryov, no. But of course that leaves the question, what could possibly have caused those crush wounds? Well, one theory, and one that at certain points in history has actually been very popular, is that it was hostile natives, that they came across some sort of sacred place, or maybe they found some people who were high on mushrooms, and this resulted in their deaths. The reason that this has been suggested is that on their way to their final destination of Mount Otorten, the Dyatlov group passed through Mansi territory. And the Mansi are a Uralic ethnic group who speak a Ugric language. This means that they're related to the Finns, Sami, the Magyar Hungarians, and a few other groups that speak similar languages and come from the same region. Traditionally semi-nomadic, the Mansi were a herding people, but they also practiced small-scale agriculture, cultivation of grains like barley. During the summer months, they would migrate to regions known to be good hunting and fishing grounds, and they would live in temporary shelters that they constructed while there. Then, during the winter, they would migrate back and live in more permanent structures and commit to reindeer herding. And winter was a culturally significant time for the Mansi, and still is to this day, because during the January-February season, they would have this religious festival. This annual celebration was tied directly to their beliefs about the animal the bear and its spiritual significance in the Mansi culture. And in addition to that, one of their sacred places was up in the Ural Mountains. There was a mountain that they believed to be a place of prayer and reverence. Now, in the diaries of the Dyatlov expedition, the word Mansi is used 20 times. The first mentions appear in the personal diaries of Rustem Slobodin and Lyudmila Dubinina for the 27th of January. And this one's pretty simple. They just write that the guys at District 41 taught them some Mansi words and that they learned how to say basic stuff. Next was on the 29th when the personal diary of Zina Kolmogorova as well as the group diary both mention that they are coming across Mansi symbols and following a Mansi trail. They also took a photograph of a Mansi-built labaz, or an elevated cache structure meant to keep things out of the reach of animals. On the 30th, the group diary, the personal diary of Zina Kolmogorova, and the unknown diary, as it's called, all mention Mansi, but I want to really quick talk about the unknown diary before we go any further. Initially, I had planned to cover this as its own segment, but as I looked more and more at it, it seemed that whoever's diary this was, it's not relevant to what happened at the end of the day. So I decided to devote my energy to stuff that may have actually had an impact. But the diary is still interesting, it's still a mystery, and I wanted to go into why. In the files, it is listed as belonging to Kolmogorova, but the thing is, we have one of Kolmogorova's diaries, it's signed as being Kolmogorova's diary, and the unknown one doesn't match its writing style or even the handwriting. That means it's not Kolmogorova's. It also mentions Klevetov, Dubinina, and Thibaut by name, meaning it's probably not any of them either. Additionally, Dubinina also had a diary, and this one doesn't match hers. The first entry in the diary mentions Bienko and says they wouldn't let him come, which means this probably isn't Zolotaryov. And in addition to all of this, Dyatlov, Yudin, and Slobodin all kept their own diaries, and none of them match with this one. That means that this diary has to have belonged to either Krivonyshenko or Doroshenko. Since Krivonyshenko and Doroshenko were the first two to die, I think it's very unlikely that they would have anything to do with the deaths of the rest. But what the author of that diary did do was include the word Mansi on the 30th of January entry. Along with theirs, one entry in the group diary, which is not signed, so we're not sure entirely who it was that wrote it, but they said that the Mansi have been a topic of much discussion in the group, and it also remarks that they passed a Mansi shed, as well as briefly informing the reader that the Mansi are a small northern nation of 8,000 people. A second group entry reads, "This is the story of the forest. Mansi signs tell about animals they saw, resting stops, and other things. It is particularly interesting to solve its meaning for the hikers as well as historians." Interestingly enough, the person who was supposed to be going along as the local historian was Bienko. The unknown diary records similar details, describing the Mansi tree markings as all sorts of obscure and mysterious characters, and claiming that the slogan for the trip should be "in a country of mysterious signs." Finally, for the 30th, Kolmogorov's diary notes the end of the Mansi Trail, but also says that they stayed the night on the Mansi Trail, which is confusing. I'm not sure particularly what that means. It might be explained by the diary entry on the 31st, that of Igor Dyatlov, in which he says that they actually got off of the Mansi Trail and then found it later. And that is unfortunately all he says of the matter. So throughout the diary entries, there is no record of an encounter with any Mansi hunters or just coming across a village, none of that. The closest they get at any point is they see one of their tree signs. Once the group was reported missing, however, a number of Mansi actually participated in the search, and several were questioned during the investigation. One group, the Batiyara village, said that a number of young hikers had come through their area and had actually had tea at their yurt but hadn't stayed the night. However, they said that this occurred on the 6th of February, which means that either this was not the Dyatlov group, that the Dyatlov group survived a lot longer and took a much more circuitous route than previously thought, or that the Mansi themselves were lying for some reason. Occam's razor, the solution requiring the fewest number of assumptions, would suggest that it was probably just a different group of hikers. We know that the Blinov group was in the area at the time, and that could have well been them. There were also a number of other hiking trips going on in the same area of the Urals, so it really could have been anybody. Part of the reason I say this almost certainly wasn't the Dyatlov group is that they were at Kuryakov by February 1st, which means that they would have had to, in just 5 days, make their way all the way back down the river Lovza and the Ospia, go west along the river Vizay, have tea with these guys on the 6th, and then get all the way back up to Kuryakov for some reason, where they died. And during that entire period of time, they would have, for some reason, taken absolutely no pictures and recorded nothing in their diaries. So, really seems impossible. And by extension, that means that there's no encounter with the Mansi, and the Mansi were likely not involved. However, in 2019, a Russian man did come forward and say that he knew the secret of Dyatlov Pass, and that the Mansi were very much responsible. This is going to be a lot of Russian names, so forgive me for looking at my notes so much, but Anatoly Stepochkin told the Komsomolskaya Pravda paper, originally a communist tabloid aimed at the 14 to 28-year-old demographic, that he had visited the Mansi in 1981 while on an assignment to collect a large shipment of fish, approximately 6 tons. According to him, while returning to Karpinsk from Serenpol, he came across a yurt while driving off-road. The owner came out to meet him and his partner, who had actually run into the yurt on their way up, and they asked, "Hey, could we stay the night with you?" And he obliged them. He said, "Yeah, sure, come on in." Then, after Anatoly's partner, Anatoly, had gone to sleep, Anatoly, the former, and the Mansi man had a, bottle of vodka together. As Anatoly's story goes, he asked the Mansi man, "Hey, how is it that you feel so comfortable living like this? You don't have locking doors, you leave some of your belongings right outside, how does this not bother you?" And the Mansi guy just tells him, "We don't need to hide anything, we are the owners here. If someone takes something, we'll find it anyway." And then at this point, the hunter told him that a while back, some tourists looted our sacred place. Shaman and hunters tracked them down, and in the middle of the night when they fell asleep, The shamans cut the tent and launched smoke inside. The hunters surrounded the tent, and when the tourists jumped out, we all killed them. 9 or 10 there were. Now, this claim was somewhat bolstered by the fact that back in 1959, investigators did find a Mansi structure within the vicinity of the Dyatlov group. This was reported in the testimony of a search party member and fireman by the name of Alexei Cheglikov on March 6, 1959. Cheglikov said that they found Mansi tracks about 10 kilometers from where the group was, and then about 1 kilometer away, they found a chum. A chum is a type of temporary hunting shelter used by the Mansi, and it's akin to a Native American teepee. And he said that when it was found in late February, it looked relatively newly constructed. And if you look at Cheglikov's testimony, as well as many others, it seems that the idea that the Mansi were involved and that there was something to do with a sacred mountain was already floating around at this time. So for Anatoly Sapochkin to bring it up 30 years later isn't super surprising. The thing is that Cheglikov, as well as basically everyone else who was involved who was remotely familiar with the Mansi, said that it almost definitely, if not definitely, was not them. For example, Cheglikov pointed out that there was no Mansi sacred place where the hikers were found, and their sacred mountain was in fact 40 kilometers to the south at the headwaters of the Vizay River. In addition to that, Anatoly Sapochkin had said that the hikers, that what they had done was they had taken gold and platinum and furs from this sacred Mansi cave, and that this is why they were punished. But the Mansi don't leave gold and platinum and furs at the sacred mountain. That's just not what they do. In my opinion, based on the evidence presented, it seems like Sapochkin made this story up, though for what reason I don't know. He first came forward with the story in the 2010s while he was being questioned because a shotgun that he had once owned or currently owned was used in a crime, and he told police that he got the shotgun from that Mansi hunter back in 1981. So it could be that this was some way of maybe trying to throw the police something that would not suspect him for, I really don't know. In my opinion, it seems very unlikely that the Mansi had anything to do with this disappearance, at least in any direct way, and that seems to be the opinion of most people who testified. An Igor Shagin said that he had hunted in Mansi lands for decades and he knew the people well, and that they had only ever been friendly and hospitable to ethnic Russians like himself. He also agreed that there was no sacred place on that mountain. Grigory Kuryakov, a Mansi himself and a hunter, said that they have no rules against Russians traveling to their sacred mountain, and he also confirmed that it was many kilometers south of Peak 1079 or Kholat-Syakul. A Mansi named Konstantin Shoshkin told investigators that he'd seen the tracks of Dyatlov's group on the 1st of February, covered in 4 to 5 centimeters of snow along the Lozva River. And he clarified further that Mansi people don't even go to the sacred mountain to pray anymore. They pray either at home or not at all. And then another man by the name of Andrei Anyamov was with Shoshkin that day, and he said that there are no sacred places here. Now, one slightly weird thing that comes up in this testimony is that he says that they were 1.5 to 2 kilometers above the Aspia when they saw the tracks. Now, that could be read to mean a few things. The one that comes to mind, if this were written originally in English, would be that that means that they are upriver. If they found tracks 1.5 to 2 kilometers upriver of the confluence between the Aspia and the Lozva, I'm struggling to understand how this makes sense. That would mean that Dyatlov's group went past the Aspia, then worked their way back down south and then along it. One possibility could be that they mistook the Aspia turnoff for the Lozva turnoff and had meant to go that way, which would actually make more sense because that takes you right to their destination. But it could also be that this was simply a mistranslation, that he didn't mean that they were above the Aspia as in upriver, but rather that they were, above it geographically, that they were up in the mountains about 1.5 to 2 kilometers. In addition to that, a Russian by the name of Ivan Uvarov argued heavily against Mansi involvement. He confirmed everything that was previously stated and also said that if a Mansi was involved in the deaths, no Mansi would have taken part in the search. Basically, if it was one of ours, we would not have helped to incriminate them. So the general consensus amongst all testimonies seems to be that the Mansi were not involved. But some people have argued that just because the Mansi weren't directly involved doesn't mean they didn't know what happened. If you go online, you'll see a few more kind of out there theories, and one of them centers upon this photograph, which is labeled Film 3 Frame 17. Now, who took this picture is unknown. It's believed to come from a camera operated by Thibault, but as we said, nobody's really sure. And though blurry, it does very clearly depict a humanoid form, dark in color, leaning out from behind a tree. It's also one of the more out-of-focus shots on that film roll, which could suggest that it was taken in haste without taking the time to adjust the lens. In addition, a document found at the tent labeled Evening o Torten, written on February 1st, 1959, includes an interesting couple of sentences in its science section. It reads, "In recent years, there has been a heated debate about the existence of Yeti. According to recent reports, Yeti lives in the northern Ural, near Mount o Torten. And while not so famous as the Yeti or Bigfoot, a Mansi folklore creature known as the Menk does bear a resemblance. According to The Tenacity of Ethnicity by the Georgetown anthropologist Marjorie Mendelstam Bowser, the Menk is described by the Mansi as just like humans, only they are spirits of the parallel forest world. It's also said that, like people, they can be hooligans or moody, or they can help with hunting and fishing." This is sounding a lot like a lot of the Bigfoot stuff we've just covered on this channel, by the way. And if you've seen this video but not our Bigfoot videos, we put a lot of work into them. And one of Bowser's sources said, "I do not know how they work, whether they have stone houses or wooden, or whether they build airplanes. They have various interests, good and bad." He also claimed that they have families, including wives and offspring, which suggests that even if they're different in spirit or inhabit some parallel realm, these are corporeal beings, and we see this with a lot of Northern European folklore in general. Now, whether you want to consider these guys Northern European or Western Asian, that's another discussion for another time. What I'm saying is, if you look at a lot of these cultures, we have the Otherworld and the Tuatha, we have Yggdrasil and the Aesir. It's not uncommon to see a cosmology where there are physical beings who inhabit different realms that you can cross between. This is likely also what was meant by "I don't know how they work, whether they have stone houses or wooden." He's saying, "I don't know the specific details about their lives. Here's what I do know." Another source that I took a look at was The World of the Conti Epic Hero Princes, which is by the late Arthur Hatto, a professor of German at the University of London from 1953 until his retirement in 1977. He died in 2010 at the age of 99. And this is relevant because the Conti are very closely related to the Mansi, culturally and ethnically, even though their languages are oddly distinct for being so close together. This could suggest that the Mansi had originated further west, or that they made their way west and then came back, but again, other stuff for other times. The point is that the Mansi and the Conti share a lot of archetypes in their storytelling. And while Arthur Hatto was not formally a Siberian ethnologist or something like that, that doesn't necessarily mean that he can't have known his stuff. I mean, look at us. I'm a medieval historian, and I have no idea what the hell you call this. Anyway, Hatto described the Menk as being more spiritual in nature, though still with physical forms. He explains that they are vaguely anthropomorphic, with eyes of stone or iron, and a peculiar inability to look down. These Menk creatures descend from heaven, and then they do battle with the Conti and Mansi hero princes, who typically are able to defeat them by attacking from below, since, the Menk can't look down. They also talk about these battles taking place frequently with the hero princes in rivers, and when I think about eyes of stone or iron and attacking people from below in rivers, I do have to wonder if this could possibly have to do with Vikings, but again, I don't want to make any sort of blanket statement. I just look at that and I'm like, interesting. But the point here is that the Mansi do have folklore of these things called Menk that are described as, humanoids who are out inhabiting the wilderness, and they're very strong, and they have to be defeated by these hero princes. Sounds, like it could be relevant. Then we have the name of the mountain upon which Dyatlov Pass now rests, Kuryakov, which in most retellings you will see is translated as Mountain of the Dead. Or you might get the Mountain of Death, or, Dead Man's Mountain, things like that. That sinister title and the crush injuries to Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibault have led a lot of people to ask the question, could this disaster be the work of some Yeti-like creature? And as fun in a dark way as that prospect is, there are a few issues with it. First is the name Kuryakov. The name is a transliteration of a Mansi word meaning dead top, dead hill, dead peak. And this is according to the Russian geologist Vera Varsanovyeva, who spent several years working in the Northern Urals during the 1920s. And in 1929, she wrote either a paper or a book where she kind of described what this mountain is and why it's called that. And according to her, there was just no vegetation up there. It was all shale. So, because there was nothing living on the mountain, it was called Dead Mountain. I think it could be possible that part of the reason that this has been reinterpreted to mean that there was some Mansi belief that the mountain was dangerous could be that between 1929 and 1959, the climate warmed and trees made their way back up that mountain so that when people got there, a name like Dead Top because there's nothing there, that didn't make any sense. And in the years since 1959, dozens of expeditions have gone across that exact same territory, and nothing bad has happened to any of them. So this would suggest that the mountain is actually rather safe if you're well prepared. Another issue with this is the injuries sustained by the group, because they're just not consistent with an attack by a large humanoid. While Zolotaryov and Dubinina both had fatal chest injuries, they were certainly uninjured upon reaching the den, and almost certainly uninjured upon its completion. As we discussed in the previous installment in this series, whatever caused them to leave the tent does not seem to be what killed them, unless it followed them down the mountain, but that also seems very unlikely for a number of reasons that we covered, but things like footprints, manner of death, all of that. And we also know that both groups were stationary at the cedar for a while, about half an hour at least, so if something was chasing them, it probably would have dealt with them there. You may be about to say, but Aiden, two of them did die at the cedar. Well, they clearly did not die of the same kind of injury. In fact, it seems like their injuries aren't what killed them at all. They probably died just of hypothermia and exhaustion. Still, many people online have looked at the combat leaflet Evening O'Torton mentioning the Yeti, as well as the photograph that is allegedly a Yeti, as evidence that they were being followed the whole time. However, if you read the leaflet, you have to take it in context, because if you look at the rest of what's on it, it's very clearly comedic. It includes mentions of increased birth rate among hikers, a quiz asking if 9 hikers could get by with 1 stove and 1 blanket, and so on. As for the photograph, if you look closely, you can tell that the torso and the legs are definitely different shades or colors. You can see a division at the hips where there is a lighter top and a darker bottom. This would be the jacket and pants of whoever is in the picture, and the darkened face is simply the hood pulled up with a shadow. You can also vaguely see, because of the blurriness of the photo, a set of tracks leading to where the subject of the photograph is. And since it appears on the same roll of film as a lot of pictures believed to have been taken by Thibault, who was something of a class clown, a bit of a joker, it seems likely that this could have been a simple prank, like, hey, I'm going to take this silly photograph and tell people back home we saw a Yeti. But even if some sort of Yeti or Menk was responsible for all of this, it seems very unlikely that they were reporting about it in Evening O'Torton, or that anyone caught it on camera. Whether or not there was a Yeti, however, cameras still play a significant role in some of the more conspiratorial theories regarding what happened that evening. Specifically, there are questions about how many cameras there were and if some of them were hidden or covered up, as well as questions about a specific frame found on one of Krivonashenko's rolls, as well as the entirety of a roll found in Zolotaryov's camera. First off, there's some dispute about how many cameras there were, partially because Yuri Yudin, the survivor, is quoted as saying 2 different things. In one instance, he says there were only 4 cameras, but in another instance, he says that almost everyone had one. The almost everyone had one is a direct quote from Yuri Yudin, while the other one seems to be people saying he said it. Thankfully, we don't have to rely purely on Yuri Yudin, because we have cameras and film rolls and project plans and all of that to go off of. The project plan, for example, lists 3 cameras borrowed from the university, that being Ural Polytechnic Institute, and the search report lists that 3 were found in the tent. However, there were 4 found total. The unlisted one was the one found on Zolotaryov's body in May. It could be that the reason Zolotaryov had a camera that wasn't listed on the project plan was that Zolotaryov was not on the project plan, and this could have been a personal camera that he himself owned. One of the major sources that we've used for this series has been Dyatlovpass.com, which has basically every file on this to ever be released to the public. And their authors argue that there were at least 5, possibly 6 cameras, basing this upon the fact that rolls 1 and 3 Allegedly, as far as they say, again, I was not able to corroborate this myself, but they say that rolls 1 and 3 are not compatible with any of the cameras that were recovered. Unfortunately, I really don't know how accurate that is, so I can't assess that. I will say that if this were some sort of cover-up and that the cameras were confiscated, it doesn't make sense to confiscate the cameras but not the film. In addition to that, film 1 was actually immediately sent to Vladislav Bienko as soon as it was found so that he could process it. So to me, that doesn't sound like a cover-up at all. That sounds like asking somebody who's not even an official investigator or part of the crime bureau. In any case, for the most part, there's little of interest on any of the film rolls, of which there are 6, and then also a selection of loose photos that aren't from those film rolls, and then finally a damaged roll that was in Zolotaryov's camera. Films 1 and 6 seem to have been shot by Yuri Krivonashenko, and they are actually mislabeled. It seems that film 6 was shot before film 1. Film 6 covers basically everything up through them being at 2nd Northern, and film 1 starts as they're leaving 2nd Northern. Film 2 is believed to have been shot by Zolotaryov, and it includes entirely pictures taken before the hike. These pictures are only put online in negative form, so it's hard to look at precisely what's in them, but they appear to depict large groups of people. As previously noted, film 3 is believed to have been shot by Thibault. It mostly shows group shots, a few landscapes, and then Thibault himself falling backwards into the snow. It's unclear if this was taken on a timer or if somebody else pushed him and then took the pictures. Either way, it just seems like he was having some fun. It's also the roll that has the shot of the quote-unquote Yeti. Film 4 is believed to have been shot by Rustem Slobodin, and it shows, once again, a few landscapes, some group shots, and a few action shots of people doing things, as well as one of some Mansi markings. Frustratingly, several of the images are damaged and have large black blurs over, most of the photograph, so it's hard to tell what's actually in it. Film 5, in my opinion, seems to have been mostly shot by Dyatlov, but DyatlovPass.com's authors argue that it probably wasn't because he appears on that film not looking at the camera on several occasions. And of course that indicates another photographer, but in my opinion, that website places a little bit too much importance on who owned which camera and which roll of film, and doesn't seem to account for the possibility that people would have, passed the cameras around, shared for some reason or another, asked other people to take pictures of them, so on and so forth. I think it's especially likely that these cameras were shared to some extent because they were property of the school. And as I said, it seems that Zolotaryov did actually bring his own camera. He's probably the only one who had ownership of it. And this is likely because he was not a student of UPI, nor was he a graduate. In general, the pictures show that the group was getting along well, and there is no visible animosity between any of the group members. That said, there are a few frames worth discussing. To begin with, there are 12 quote-unquote loose photos that the origin can't be determined. All of these images come from the archive of lead investigator Lev Ivanov, and all of them seem to have been taken during the trip, with the exception of one depicting a young woman who had been on a different trip with Lyudmila Dubinina at a different time. There are 2 possibilities here, one of which is that there was an additional young woman on the trip who isn't mentioned in a single document and doesn't appear in any other photographs, or that this just got mixed in with the archive. This could suggest that this was an additional camera that belonged to Dubinina and that she hadn't taken the film out between the last trip and this one. But it's also possible that Kolevatov, who appears in none of these photographs from the loose photo collection, but does appear in other people's film rolls, was the photographer. Either way, there's nothing on the photos that's really incriminating of everything, just people having a good time. Questions are also frequently asked about one of Krivonashenko's pictures, and he seems to have been the most experienced photographer and the most prolific out of the bunch. And the picture in question is referred to either as frame 34 or frame 33 on film roll number 1, and the reason for the difference in numbering is whether or not you actually use the 15th frame on the roll. Frame 15 just is very low quality, it's damaged, so frequently it's kind of been ignored, but as there were more questions about photography, it was added to the database. Frame 34 seems to depict several lights against a dark background, which has led a lot of people to believe that it's a blurry picture of the sky, and that the lights are some form of UFO. What kind of UFO is unclear. Some people say missile, some people say alien spaceship, some people say experimental aircraft. One guy said demons. Those skeptical of this proposition argue that since the camera was found with the shutter cocked, this was probably just an image taken by the lab tech so that he could take the film roll out. On the other hand, the more conspiracy-minded folks ask the question, why would an experienced photographer like Krivonishenko leave the shutter cocked unless he was anticipating taking a picture of something? If we look at the previous two images on the roll, they were both taken on February 1st as they were setting up camp on the mountain, so the two possibilities are that this was taken February 1st or 2nd, or that it was taken by the lab tech, and in my opinion, the latter seems more likely. What gives some people pause about that conclusion, however, is what was found on Zolotaryov's camera, which contained 11 heavily damaged images that depict bright spots against a dark background. These frames are intriguing for a number of reasons, but first among them is what they are said to depict. Allegedly, these are pictures of UFOs, and that is according to searcher Valentin Yakimenko. However, self-proclaimed psychic Cora Hull takes it a step further. The first of the frames she refers to as the three heads, and says that it shows a bright object above the heads of 3 group members. The next several are called woven mesh, lynx, horn, jaws, and mushroom with a face. The last 5 are flight-related, at least for the most part. 2 of them are called eagle, and it's said that it's an eagle-shaped object moving behind a jagged tree trunk. Image 9 is simply referred to as chicken, and then the following 2 are both called plane, because it kind of looks like a plane. And according to Cora Hull, these images are clear indication of fallen angel / higher level demonic involvement. And of the frames, she says, several of which appear to capture a partial physical manifestation of a shape-shifting demon. On the other hand, Zolotaryov's camera had been submerged in water for several months before the film was developed, so they could just be heavily damaged. And I just do not have time to go into how inaccurate her perception of biblical demons is from the rest of the website. It's rough. You ever been on, like, Boomer Book of Revelation TikTok? It's Boomer Book of Revelation TikTok. Obviously, it's not 100% certain that frame 34 was taken by a lab tech, or that Zolotaryov's camera doesn't show demonic manifestations, but I would argue those are the less likely options. And that's not because I don't believe in demons, that's because I don't believe he captured images of demons. What I'm much more curious about when it comes to the camera stuff is not what was on the cameras, but why Zolotaryov had a camera on him in the first place. Not for the trip, that makes complete sense. I'm wondering why, as everyone was evacuating the tent, throwing on whatever clothes they could, and trying to get to the tree line, why did Zolotaryov put on his camera? Or, if he already had the camera on him, late at night, why? As I mentioned earlier, Zolotaryov was not initially part of the team. He was not expected to go on the trip by anybody who had planned the trip. His spot was initially held by a man named Vladislav Bienko, who was a good friend and classmate of Dyatlov. But just a few days before the expedition was supposed to start, Bienko was summoned by the Komsomol committee for a hearing. Now, the Komsomol was basically the Soviet version of the Hitler Youth, officially known as the All-Union Leninist Young Communist League. And it was quite literally an organization founded for the purpose of taking young people and making them Soviets. That's all it was. Like, really genuinely indistinguishable from the Hitler Youth. You could kind of look at it as, like, authoritarian Boy Scouts. At this hearing, Bienko was informed that because he had spent his holiday doing mountain hikes in preparation for this mountain hike as practice, that he would not be allowed to go because his classmates had all been doing community service and had been, performing civic functions and helping with the economy and such. So Bienko, because he hadn't fulfilled his appropriate community service over winter break, he had to go and work at a lumber camp instead of go on the hike. He was then ordered to give his food and supplies and everything to Zolotaryov, who would take his place as the 10th group member. And in interviews, Bienko described Zolotaryov as a cheerful guy who knew many hiking and camp songs and easily fit into the friendly Dyatlov group, including the detail that he was an instructor at the Korovkova base camp. Korovka base camp. There we go. And in the end, Bienko actually may have been somewhat instrumental in finding the group, because when they didn't check in on time, he was called up as the only person who actually knew the exact route they were supposed to take, because Dyatlov had failed to submit a proper map. And as I said earlier, it was also Bienko who was asked to process the initial rolls of film. Asked his opinion during the same interview about what happened, he said that he believed that when the group left the tent, they were healthy, at least physically, that whatever caused them to leave, it was likely psychological. And this, in his opinion, was why they seemed to have become far more organized upon reaching the cedar. From there, he believed that the group split into three, with Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin making for the tent, while Zolotaryov, Tibo, and Dubinina went to build the den. The other three, Doroshenko, Krivonishenko, and Kolevatov, he says, stayed by the cedar, probably to cut more branches. He believed that Dyatlov's group succumbed to hypothermia, as well as Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, and that whatever happened to the group at the den, Kolevatov heard it happen and came running, and that's why he seems to have died of hypothermia, clutching Zolotaryov to his chest. And in reading Bienko's interview and some of the testimonies and looking at all the photographs and the diary entries and all of that, I realized that a man who was never supposed to be there in the first place became central to the entire conspiracy theory. And it made me wonder, who was this Semyon Zolotaryov character, and why was he specifically chosen to replace Bienko on such short notice? Officially, Semyon Alexeyevich Zolotaryov was added to the trip because somebody needed to replace Vladislav Bienko. But elements of Zolotaryov's background, as well as the condition of his remains, have led to some questions. To begin with, when Zolotaryov's body was found, he was dressed in several layers of his own clothes, which was nearly unique amongst the group. Aside from Zolotaryov and Tibo, everyone else in the group appears to have been dressed for bed when it was decided they had to leave the tent. They likely threw on whatever they could find in haste and then just made their way out down the mountain. And we know it must have been hasty because several of them were not wearing shoes. As a quick recap, we were able to deduce that every member of the group left the tent with underwear, undershirt, a pair of socks, at least one, long underwear or sweatpants, an overshirt, and a sweater or light jacket. Since this was uniform amongst the team, we can infer that this was the sleeping gear and that the light jackets probably were the main addition, as well as possibly extra socks. And in selecting any additional clothing, they likely went for the socks and jackets first, because you can't put on a parka or boots underneath those things. We also know that Krivonishenko and Doroshenko must have died before Dyatlov's group made their way up the mountain, because they were wearing some of the clothes taken from Doroshenko and Krivonishenko's bodies. Zolotaryov and Tibo, on the other hand, seem to have been fully dressed at the time of evacuation, though they were wearing different kinds of boots. Tibo had a pair of felt boots called valenki, while Zolotaryov had quilted boots called burki, and both of these would have been perfectly reasonable to wear out around camp. They're very warm, they're insulated, but you wouldn't really wear them for the day hikes, the skiing trips. It seems likely that one of the two men was on watch and that the other was maybe there to keep him company. We can tell from the photographs and some of the journal entries that Tibo and Zolotaryov seem to have really hit it off. So there's nothing super odd about Tibo and Zolotaryov both being fully dressed. What's odd is that Zolotaryov had his camera. It was far too dark to be taking any meaningful pictures of anything that was on the ground, and across the entire trip, Zolotaryov seems to have taken very few photos at all. The only pictures taken during the trip by Zolotaryov seem to be those 11 damaged ones found in his camera. So the question is, why did he have the camera with him that night? Well, one suggestion is that Zolotaryov may not have been there as a replacement for Bienko, but rather the opposite, that Bienko was removed so Zolotaryov could be placed on the trip by the Communist Party. As for why the Soviets would have gone out of their way to place this random 38-year-old guy in a group of 20-somethings, well, let's start with the actual plan of the trip. What was the goal that they were seeking here? According to the one that was submitted and approved and is listed on the DyatlovPass.com website and all that, they had 4 main objectives. The first was to get to know the nature and economy of the Northern Urals. The second was to be able to hold lectures and carry out conversations with the public. The third was to improve the skills of the hikers. And the fourth was to study the depth of soil freezing according to surveys and observations of residents in the Northern Urals. It was Objective 3 that brought Semyon Zolotaryov into the fold according to the official narratives from both 1959 and the 2010s. Everyone on this trip was certified to go on and I believe lead Category 2 hikes, and upon completion, every member of this trip would achieve their Category 3 certification. Now, I didn't go into it earlier, we covered it in a previous video, but the reason for these certifications is that in Soviet Russia, your hike wasn't just you going on a hike. You had to have a reason for everything you were doing. Everything had to be in service of the party in some way or another. So you couldn't just, like Aiden or I could just hop on a plane and go hiking in Yosemite and nobody would bat an eye. But for these guys, they had to submit a detailed project plan. There had to be a reason they were doing all of this. And if you wanted to go on a Category 3 hike, you had to be going with somebody who was allowed to lead a Category 3 hike. Basically a long-winded way of saying you had less freedom. As I said previously, Zolotaryov was the eldest member of the group at 38, and in his case, this trip was entirely for professional reasons. He wanted to get the Master of Sports title, he needed to go on this trip to get the Master of Sports title. Now what's interesting is that prior to joining the Dyatlov expedition, Zolotaryov had enlisted in an expedition led by a man named Sogrin, and this one was going to take 25 days, 10 days longer than Dyatlov's. In explaining to Sogrin why he had requested the change, Zolotaryov allegedly told him that he wanted to take his mother to the Caucasus before the start of the busy season. And it's said that this conversation happened several days before the Dyatlov expedition left. Of course, we don't know how many days. It's unclear if this was before or after Bienko was removed. And I'm not the only one to make that connection. The other members of the Dyatlov group wondered about it and were, skeptical that maybe the Communist Party had something to do with this. And it wasn't actually that Bienko had done something wrong, it was that the party wanted Zolotaryov there. The question then is why? You see, Semyon Zolotaryov was not always a sporting instructor. Born February 2nd, 1921, he was one of only 3% of men in his draft class to survive the violence of World War II, in which he served from 1941 until its conclusion, and then for a year afterwards. Fun fact, in the documents it calls this the Great Patriotic War. Not sure what's so patriotic about invading Poland and Finland and then getting betrayed by the angry mustache man, but hey, who knows? During the war, he earned awards for his participation in the battles of Stalingrad, Königsberg, and then one for the victory over Germany, as well as the Order of the Red Star for courage in battle. He tried to continue his military career after the war, enrolling at a couple of different military engineering schools, but unfortunately, those schools both closed because there was no longer a war. Unable to carve out a place for himself in the military, he enrolled at the Minsk Institute of Physical Education and graduated in 1951. After that, he worked as a secretary for the Communist Party and also as a sports instructor. His first post was at the Artybash sporting base in Altai, and that was until he was transferred in 1955 to Kuryakov. In May of 1955, he was actually brought before the Communist Party to answer for his crimes. What were his crimes, or the alleged crimes? Well, bribing a Communist Party official, allegedly beating his aunt, and lying about his brother defecting to the Nazis. He wrote a letter explaining his point of view, in which he is apologetic about the bribe, saying that it was necessary, but he feels bad about it now. He also said that the whole thing with his aunt was a complete misunderstanding, and that they were arguing, and what happened was he opened a door and it hit her. And when it came to his brother being a defector, he said that, at the time, he still looked up to his brother and he still loved his brother, but he could see now that his brother was a traitor and a scoundrel and, he would do whatever it took to reestablish his place in the party. Essentially what this was a struggle session, bringing him in to grovel and apologize and debase himself, all while the people in charge talked about, and I'm not even kidding, these are the words they use, how they should re-educate him. The fun part of this story is all the little reminders about what kind of hell the Soviet Union was. In the end, despite the fact that he told them he was, willing to do whatever it took and even denounced his own family members, they fired him from his Communist Party position, but did allow him to remain a sporting instructor. I did, by the way, take a look at where his former posting was and where his post in the Urals was. The former one was a lot warmer. I would not be surprised if the transfer was punishment in the first place. The weird part is that the position he occupied, not in the party, but as a sporting instructor, should have had a salary of somewhere around 750 rubles a month. Semyon Zolotaryov, on the other hand, was making 1,200 rubles a month. Nobody seems to know why he made so much money, or why the Communist Party would go out of its way to give him a slightly shorter trip just a few years after he had been severely reprimanded and recommended for re-education. One possibility is that as part of his re-education, again, their word not mine, he was tasked with performing special duties for the party, and maybe this come with an incentive of higher pay. After all, he did have a couple of pretty unique and important skills, being both a veteran and an experienced outdoorsman. Even if Zolotaryov was still secretly working for the party, however, there's little indication as to what his role or purpose on the trip would have been. I don't believe that he had anything to do with the deaths of the other 8 people along with him. It makes very little sense, even if they sent him out there to die, that they would sacrifice 8 people who were otherwise very intelligent, highly valuable to the party, and loyal to the party. Rather, I wonder if his being there had something to do with why he had his camera on him at such an odd time of night. Maybe he was there to keep an eye on the other members of the party. Maybe somebody was suspected of something. Maybe he was supposed to get pictures of them. Or maybe he was supposed to document something else along the way, something that the party itself wanted to know about. One thing that comes to mind is that Klevetov was supposed to be going to work in the nuclear arms division of the Soviet Union, so they may have thought we'd send Semyon Zolotaryov along to keep an eye on that guy, but then again, why now? It's also possible that he was there to observe some kind of test. After all, there were witnesses who said that they saw a bright light arcing across the sky that night, but they did say that they saw it over towards the horizon, which would mean it was very far away from where anyone was. No matter how you look at it, nothing explains with any degree of certainty why Zolotaryov had his camera out that night, and as a result, we can't say for certain that Zolotaryov's presence had anything to do with what happened. Aside from the theory that this was hostile natives or a Yeti, or that Zolotaryov was a secret agent, or perhaps that the cameras held the key to uncovering the mystery of Dyatlov Pass, there are a few other aspects that are frequently questioned about this case. For example, the presence of radiation on some articles of clothing is often cited as evidence that there was a nuclear test, or that they passed through some sort of radiation cloud, or possibly even an unmarked mine or some sort of refinery facility. We did cover this in part 2, but I added a little bit more detail to this version, and I wanted to give you a recap anyway. So, the way this goes is that Klevetov's pants, as well as Krivonischenko's sweater, which was found on Dubinina, were both mildly radioactive. Both Klevetov and Krivonischenko did work with radioactive material in their day-to-day lives, but the forensic radiologist said that the amounts of radiation far exceeded what he would have expected even from people who do that. Krivonischenko's sweater was the most radioactive piece of clothing recovered, while Klevetov's pants were about half as bad. And these items of clothing were still significantly more radioactive than the radiologist anticipated, even after at least 2 weeks in running water. In addition to that, I'm not sure if this is odd or not, because I'm not a nuclear physics person, but only beta particles were present, no alpha or gamma. Because I lack any knowledge of how nuclear radiation works, I'm not even going to hazard a guess, and I'm just going to give you the radiologist's opinions. He said that radiation could only have accumulated to that degree if they had passed through a radioactive area, had been in direct prolonged contact with a radioactive object, or if they had passed through a radioactive dust cloud. It was his opinion that the radioactive dust cloud or the prolonged exposure hypothesis were the culprit. But I do have some questions about the logic that I would like to present in case anybody in the audience is experienced in nuclear radiation. Those questions are, shouldn't we expect that if they passed through a radioactive dust cloud, all of them would have been irradiated? The other question is it possible that a lack of safety protocols could have led to this degree of radiation in their clothes? In any case, it doesn't seem to be radiation that killed them, and it seems to have only affected the people in the den group. However, some people aren't so sure that that's the only group affected. There are a few pieces floating around out there, as well as a rumor that in the rest of 1959 as well as 1960, hikers were banned from going to the area. In addition to that, locals were told that they should not graze their animals or drink from wells in the area for a little while, for a period of I think a couple of years. In reality, there was never a ban on hikers in the region, and while there was something of a ban on grazing and using wells, it was because of necrobacteriosis, not because of radiation. Now, it's possible that it was actually because of radiation and they were lying, but the official reason is necrobacteriosis, and I have really no evidence to say they're wrong. From what I could tell, it seemed like there were actual witness testimonies from the time that it was in fact necrobacteriosis. The other enduring question that we have yet to address is one that deals with tools, because they must have used something to cut branches, both at the cedar, where they built a campfire and cut down several branches, as well as at the den, where they created a floor out of cedar boughs. In both locations, investigators were very confident that the branches had not been broken off. They had been cut. Now, on its face, this is not all that strange, as we know that Thibault, Krivonischenko, and Kolevatov all carried Finnish-style puko knives, and that Dyatlov had a pocket knife. And in addition to those knives, they had 3 axes. The weird part of all of this is that not a single knife or axe was found at the cedar or the den. Krivonischenko, Thibault, and Dyatlov's knives were all found in the tent, as were the 3 axes. Later on, when they recovered the bodies of Zolotaryov's group, they did find a sheath for that exact style of knife carried by Kolevatov. However, they didn't find the knife. It just was not there. The sheath was, Kolevatov was, but no knife. Then later, on a report about what was found at the tent, suddenly Kolevatov's sheath and knife both show up. On the one hand, it's possible that they were wrong and the sheath and knife were actually found in the tent, but on the other hand, it's possible that Ivanov lied and said that the sheath and knife were found in the tent so that he could finally wrap up the investigation and submit a report. In my opinion, looking at the two and looking at everything else I know about this case, it seems more likely that Ivanov lied and that the sheath was found and the knife simply just was not found. Based on the available evidence, it seems like Kolevatov most likely had his knife even at the den and that it was just never found by the searchers. This explains how they cut the branches, and thus it removes that mystery from the equation. The other tool issue is more about the possibility that someone else was there, because while 1 ice axe is listed on the project plan, 2 are listed amongst the items found, 1 at the tent and 1 at their labaz. But given the fact that only 2 axes are listed on the project plan, but 3 were found, and the fact that Thibault and Krivonischenko just straight up had illegal knives that they weren't supposed to have with them at all, to me this seems like it could very easily be an inventory reporting issue rather than some sort of cover-up. So where does that leave us? Making this video was a frustrating exercise, primarily because I feel like we're no closer to an answer. That said, I do feel like we've firmly ruled out a few things, which should make it easier to focus our energy on this in the future, should we choose to do so. First off, the tools, as we just discussed, were likely not an issue. They had a knife to cut branches, it got lost. They had 1 ice axe, it got reported twice. They had 3 axes, all 3 were found at the tent. We also have the alleged bands, one of which simply didn't exist, and the other had nothing to do with radiation. As for the radiation, that was isolated to the clothing of 2 men who worked with radioactive materials in 1959, long before any true safety precautions were in place. We also know that one of them, Krivonischenko, the one with the more irradiated sweater, had been at the Chelyabinsk 40 plant when the Kishtim disaster happened, and that nobody washed their clothes upon returning home that day. It's not like nail in the coffin on the radiation thing, but I certainly think that it's not the most mysterious aspect of this case. When it comes to the Yeti theory, there's just, zero evidence that it could be a remote possibility. The alleged photographic evidence is clearly just a joke, and the Evening O'Torton bit is just that. It's a bit. And even if we assume that Yetis are real, why did it only attack 3 of them? Why didn't it kill them at the tent? And why did it let them build the den first? Then we can look at Semyon Zolotaryov, who, while a weird last-minute addition to the group, can't really explain what happened. He may have been assigned some secret mission, but he plainly didn't kill anyone, and there's no reason to think that they would go to such lengths to get rid of him at the expense of what should have been 9 other people. Finally, it seems quite clear that the Mansi were not involved. Nobody could place them at the scene, they actively helped search for the hikers, and as far as anybody can tell, they had no motive. Plus, the Mansi wouldn't have let them leave the tent in the first place if this was an attack. One thing that does stick with me is a 2013 interview with Vladislav Bienko, in which he describes his and Lev Ivanov's thoughts and opinions in 1959. He said that nobody considered an avalanche, which is now the prevailing theory, until Zolotaryov and the others were found at the den. And he said that Ivanov felt certain that these deaths could not have been the result of natural causes. Of course, that is with the exception of Kolevatov. And according to Bienko, he did see Ivanov once after the discovery of Zolotaryov, Thibault, and Dubinina, and he said that it seemed as if he had aged many years, but more importantly, the liveliness of his character had disappeared. And honestly, I can see why. Ivanov, by all accounts, aside from what may have been a little white lie about the sheath, seems to have been a good man, somebody who wanted to bring closure to the families and figure out genuinely what happened here. And it's a little crazy to sit here 65 years later pondering the exact same question he did, because at the end of this, he knew what killed Krivonischenko and Doroshenko. He knew what killed Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova. He even knew what killed Kolevatov. What he didn't know is the same exact thing that Aiden and I still don't know. What killed Thibaut, Zolotaryov, and Dubinina? Truth of the matter is, we may never know the answer to that question, but the one thing I will tell you is that Aiden and I have a lot of time, and we will not give up. And if you want to support us in that mission to get to the bottom of some of the most interesting unsolved mysteries out there, you can subscribe to our Patreon for just $1 a month. That will also get you access to the new and improved live Drunk Folklore / History. You will also gain access to that if you are a YouTube member here on the channel. These memberships are $5 a month. You can also support us by drinking our brew, which is Mount Pocono Perk from Tableau Roasting Company. This was not something I picked up off the internet. I did not say, hey, white label that and give it to me. I sat down with Matt Moore over there and I said, here's what I want my coffee to taste like, and I'm going to even tell you what beans and roast profiles I want. And if you're sitting here going, Aiden, you're a historian, what could you possibly know about coffee? A lot. We will also be bringing you very new and improved merch through Bunker Branding very soon. Still working out the details on that, but it is coming. And if you want more Lodge, you can go and check out our other channels. We have the History Hut, we have my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where I do live streams 3 nights a week, and we also put out some compilation-style content of just the streams themselves. You can also check out the Lore Lounge, which doesn't have content yet, but it will one day. Or you can go and check out our second flagship show, The Weird Bible, over on the Weird Bible channel. The Weird Bible is back, and it's live. And speaking of live things, you can check out this show's hosts live on a podcast every Sunday at 7 p.m., starting very soon as we bring you the new and improved podcast, The Lore Lads. And if you want to keep up to date with all the updates and whatnot, you can always check us out on Discord. It is bit.ly/jointhelodge, and we let you know every time a new video is out, every time a stream is going live, that kind of thing over there. Lastly, we'd like to thank Day One Journal for sponsoring this video. If you want to try Day One Journal, you can go to dayoneapp.com/lorelodge to get 2 months free of their premium service. With all that said and out of the way, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.